Bloodborne has one of the most layered, strange, and genuinely unsettling lore histories in all of gaming, and this video covers 925 individual facts about it, pulled from item descriptions, NPC dialogue, developer interviews, cut content, and years of community research, so you can just lean back, close your eyes, and let Yharnam wash over you. I put this video together because I personally find Bloodborne lore to be some of the most relaxing content to consume passively. There is something oddly soothing about lying in the dark and hearing about a crumbling Gothic city and the terrible things that happened beneath it. When assembling this script, I made the deliberate choice to front-load the city's history and only introduce the cosmic horror elements once the ground-level Yharnam is already established. I felt that jumping straight into outer gods and eldritch tentacles without context does the lore a disservice. This is an interpretation, not a definitive retelling. The lore of Bloodborne is fragmentary by design, and where evidence is thin, I will say so. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The City of Yharnam and its Origins. Yharnam is described in the game as a holy city, and that framing is deliberate. Before it became a place associated with blood and plague and hunters, it was a place of religious pilgrimage. The city's name itself points towards something ancient and sacred, and early architectural details in the game suggest it was already old before the events of the game even begin. The city is built on layers. If you pay attention to the geography of Bloodborne, you notice that Yharnam sits atop older structures, which sit atop older structures still. The deepest parts of the city are the oldest, and the oldest parts are the closest to where the Pthumerians once lived and worshipped. The Pthumerians are one of the first groups you encounter evidence of in the game, mostly through the Chalice dungeons, which represent the subterranean ruins that stretch beneath Yharnam. The Pthumerians were not human in the conventional sense. Item descriptions suggest they were a civilization that lived close to the Great Ones and were entrusted with their guardianship. One reading of the Pthumerians is that they were humanity's ancestors in the lore's cosmology, or at least a branch of early humans who achieved something close to transcendence before falling into ruin. The Chalice dungeons suggest an entire civilization collapsed down there, and all that remained were their rituals and their crypts. The presence of the Great Ones in Pthumerian worship is not incidental. Item descriptions for Pthumerian relics describe ceremonies involving blood and the higher planes, suggesting that the Pthumerians had developed a working theology around entities we would later come to know as the Great Ones of the outer cosmos. What is interesting is that the Pthumerians did not appear to fear the Great Ones. They served them. Whether that service was coerced or freely given is one of the questions the lore leaves deliberately open. The Chalice dungeons also contain enemies called Pthumerian elders, who appear as tall, thin-robed figures with considerable magical power. Their design suggests something that was once human but has moved some distance away from that state, possibly through prolonged proximity to Great Ones or through the ingestion of their blood. Blood is the central currency of Bloodborne's world in almost every sense. You spend it as currency, you use it to level up, you receive it as healing, and the entire city of Yharnam has organized its culture around it. That centrality is not accidental. It points toward a very old relationship between the people of this world and the substances that flow from things greater than themselves. The Healing Church, which dominates Yharnam by the time the game begins, built its power on the claim that its blood was sacred and restorative. That was true, in a sense. The blood they distributed did heal. But it also gradually transformed those who consumed it. And the church knew this and continued distributing it anyway. The relationship between the church and the truth of what blood does is one of the lore's most consistent tensions. The church had knowledge of the transformation process and chose to frame it as a blessing rather than a risk. Whether that was cynical manipulation or genuine theological conviction is again something the lore leaves open to interpretation. The city's architecture reflects its history in layers. The cleaner, more Gothic cathedral sections of Central Yharnam and the cathedral ward are associated with the healing church's dominance. The darker, older, more industrial sections of the lower city suggest an older Yharnam that predates church influence. The sewers and lower districts of Yharnam are significantly older in their design language than the upper city. The stonework is cruder, the architecture is more compact and defensive, and the presence of creatures like the pigs and crows suggests an area that has been abandoned to decay for a long time. There is a version of Yharnam that was a functioning city with civic life. You see evidence of this in the form of houses with furniture, shops with merchandise still on display, streets that were clearly designed for foot traffic rather than combat. The game drops you into the city mid-collapse, but the world design implies everything it had before. The clocks in Yharnam all appear to have stopped. This is a subtle environmental detail that several community members have noted. Whether this is purely atmospheric or suggests something more specific about the night of the hunt, perhaps that time itself is functioning strangely, is one of those questions the lore invites but does not answer. The moon plays a constant role in Bloodborne's atmosphere. From the opening of the game, the moon over Yharnam is large and reddish and wrong-looking. This is not normal astronomical behavior. The moon's appearance correlates with the activity of the Great Ones and with the intensity of the hunt, and by the end of the game, its nature becomes much more explicit. The red moon in Bloodborne is connected to Murgo, a Great One's child whose cries echo through the nightmare. The moon's shift toward crimson over the course of the game's night suggests that the nightmare is bleeding into waking reality, or that the Great One whose child was lost is drawing closer to the world. Yharnam sits in a part of the world that suggests a coastal or mountainous region in a northern European climate. The architecture draws heavily from Victorian Edinburgh and Prague, and the general atmosphere of cold stone streets and gas lamps places it firmly in a kind of alt history, late 19th century. The decision to set Bloodborne in a Victorian-inflected world was a deliberate departure from the medieval settings of the Souls games. The industrial era brings with it new anxieties about science and religion, about what medicine and knowledge can and cannot do, and about the speed at which certainty can be undermined by new discoveries. From Software games are known for their environmental storytelling, and Bloodborne takes this to an extreme. Almost every room in the game contains objects that tell you something about who lived there, what happened to them, and why. You are encouraged to read the world, rather than be told about it directly. One of the most effective examples of this is in the houses of Central Yharnam, where you can find cradles, children's toys, and household goods that suggest entire families were present when the plague began. The absence of children throughout most of the game, except in the form of the orphans of Iosefka's clinic and the children sent to the orphanage, is quietly devastating. The orphanage in the upper cathedral ward is one of the darker locations in a very dark game. It was officially a sanctuary for orphan children, run by the church. Unofficially, it was a site where the church conducted experiments on children it considered to have the potential for greater insight, meaning proximity to or perception of the Great Ones. The concept of insight is central to Bloodborne's world building. Insight is literally quantified in the game as a stat, and it measures how much of the hidden world your character has perceived. Higher insight makes the world stranger and more dangerous. Enemies behave differently. New things become visible, and the game's atmosphere shifts. The brain suckers, the creatures that drain your insight by latching onto your head, are one of the more literally on-the-nose expressions of this mechanic. They represent the idea that greater knowledge of the cosmic world is something to be jealously consumed or extracted, not freely shared. Early Yharnam, before the church's ascendance, was likely a mining and trade city. The lower districts have the infrastructure for industrial activity, and the proximity to the Chalice dungeons, which were presumably accessed before the church formalized that access, suggests the city grew up partly around whatever was being extracted from underground. The name Yharnam itself may carry significance. Some community researchers have connected it to names in Mesopotamian mythology, suggesting the creators were drawing on ancient Near Eastern imagery for the city's deepest roots, whether this is intentional or coincidental. The game's lore does have a consistent interest in ancient pre-Christian religious structures. The statues throughout Yharnam are worth paying attention to. The church is represented by angelic figures and saint-like figures that gradually become more disturbing as you move closer to the healing church's inner sanctum. By the time you reach the upper cathedral ward, the statues are openly tentacled and alien, reflecting the church's true object of worship. This visual shift from conventional religious iconography to something genuinely alien is one of the game's most effective pieces of lore delivery. You do not need to read a single item description to understand that the church's public face and its private theology are wildly different things. The Grand Cathedral, at the centre of the cathedral ward, is the most prominent building in the city's skyline. It dominates everything around it, architecturally, and its position at the highest navigable point of the main city reinforces the church's social dominance. Getting to it requires fighting through everything the city throws at you. Inside the Grand Cathedral, you find the remains of Vicar Amelia, a church giant who has transformed into a beast. Her prayer before attacking you is one of the game's most memorable moments. She is literally praying to become something more, using the language of insight and transcendence, right up until the moment she loses herself entirely. Vicar Amelia's presence in the Grand Cathedral suggests that the church hierarchy had already been significantly affected by the blood transformations by the time the game begins. She is not a recent victim. She is a high-ranking official who's become what the church's theology privately celebrated. The church giants, the large humanoid enemies found in and around church buildings, are believed to be church clerics or officials who underwent extreme transformation through heavy blood usage. Their design retains vestigially human elements, but has grown to a scale and form that is clearly no longer human. The relationship between blood consumption and transformation is not instantaneous. It appears to accelerate under certain conditions, and the game suggests that emotional state, psychological openness to change, and the specific source of the blood all affect the rate and nature of transformation. This is one reason the church's blood healing was so difficult to regulate. Yharnam's geography is also its history. The lowest you can go in the city, above ground, leads to areas like the Forbidden Woods, which points toward the outskirts of the city's territory. The Forbidden Woods are explicitly named, suggesting that at some point the city's authorities decided to close off access to them. The Forbidden Woods contain evidence of failed experiments, residents of Yharnam who were sent there or fled there, and creatures that suggest prolonged exposure to something in the environment. The snake-infested enemies there are particularly striking, raising questions about what exactly was being grown or transformed in that area. The village at the end of the Forbidden Woods is one of the game's quieter horror pieces. It is a collection of buildings that were once a settlement, populated by deformed, snake-infested residents who nonetheless have some remnants of community structure. They ring bells together. The normalcy of that gesture, the communal act of bell ringing, in the context of their complete physical transformation, is quietly terrible. The Healing Church workshop predates the Healing Church itself, or at least its current form. The workshop was where hunters were trained and equipped, and its position in the game world, a location you can only access by falling through a hidden area of the cathedral ward, suggests it is a deliberately buried part of the city's history. The old hunters of the workshop predated the church's dominance of the hunting profession. They were rougher, more practical, and apparently willing to experiment with unconventional weapons and techniques. The workshop's contents suggest a tradition of monster hunting that had nothing particularly sacred about it. The split between the old workshop hunters and the later church hunters is one of the lore's recurring tensions. The church hunters are more formalized, more connected to the blood sacrament, and more ideologically invested in what they are doing. The old hunters were simply doing a job. Gehrman, who you meet at the beginning and end of the game, represents the oldest surviving link to the original workshop tradition. He is the first hunter, trained by or closely associated with the figure who established the workshop, and his age and decay reflect how long the hunting profession has existed in Yharnam. The hunter's dream, where Gehrman resides, is not a real place. It is a fabricated space constructed by the doll or by the moon presence. It exists outside normal time and space, and Gehrman is trapped in it. His wheelchair and his apparent frailty suggest that even in this protected space, something is costing him enormously. The presence of the doll in the hunter's dream is one of the game's most sustained mysteries. She is a porcelain figure who has come to life and who manages the dream's functions. Her origin is connected to a real person named Lady Maria, who was one of the hunters of the old workshop era and whose likeness was used to create the doll. Lady Maria's story is told primarily in the Old Hunters DLC, and it is one of the saddest narratives in the game. She was a hunter of genuine skill and conscience, who became involved in an experiment that horrified her, and she responded to that horror by sealing herself away in a tower. The tower she sealed herself in, the Astral Clock Tower, is a location in the hunter's nightmare, another fabricated space that exists to contain the worst of what the old hunters did. The nightmare is a kind of punishment or containment zone, and the hunters trapped there are forced to relive the night of the hunt forever. The hunter's nightmare contains enemies and bosses that represent the hunters themselves, transformed by the extremity of their acts and the blood they consumed. Ludwig, the first church hunter, is found there as a beast. His recovery of his humanity in his second phase, when he sees the holy moonlight sword, is one of the game's most affecting moments. Ludwig believed, genuinely, that what the church was doing was right. He believed the hunt had sacred purpose. Finding his sword, the symbol of that faith, even after everything that was done to him and everything he became, briefly restores him before he dies. Whether that restoration is merciful or the cruelest thing the game does to him is a question you can spend a long time with. The geography of the game's nightmare spaces reflects something important about how the lore thinks about memory and guilt. The nightmare is not just a prison. It is a place that is shaped by what the people trapped there carry with them. The architecture of the hunter's nightmare mirrors Yharnam, but distorted and extended into impossible configurations. Simon the Harrowed, an NPC in the old Hunters DLC, was a researcher who came to Yharnam to study its history and ended up trapped in the nightmare. His presence there underscores that the nightmare is not limited to people who participated in the hunts. Those who came to understand what happened can also be drawn in. The fishing hamlet in the Old Hunters DLC is one of the most important locations in the game's broader cosmology. It is a small coastal community whose residents were subjected to something terrible by the Old Hunters, specifically by the workshop's researchers in pursuit of knowledge about the Great Ones. Chapter 2: The Healing Church and the Blood Ministry. The Healing Church's official history presents it as a benevolent medical institution that discovered the miraculous healing properties of blood and made them available to the people of Yharnam. That is the public story. The private story is considerably more complicated. The church's foundation is connected to a man named Lawrence, who is described in item descriptions as the first vicar, the founding figure of the church as a formal institution. Lawrence is also found in the Hunter's Nightmare as a boss transformed into a beast of enormous fire, suggesting he too did not escape what the church's theology ultimately led to. Lawrence's connection to the old workshop is direct. He knew Gehrman personally. There are item descriptions that suggest a significant falling out between the two men over the direction of the workshop and the decision to formalize the blood healing into a religious institution. Gehrman's apparent resistance to what the church became is implied, but never stated outright. What we can say is that the workshop and the church represent genuinely different philosophies about what hunting is and what blood is for. Gehrman seems to have remained skeptical of the church's theological framing throughout. The blood that the church distributed was not ordinary blood. It was blood connected to the Great Ones, specifically to the presence of a Great One's cadaver beneath Yharnam, in the Chalice dungeon spaces, and possibly connected to other sources the church had identified and was keeping secret. The Pthumerian Queen Yharnam, whose name echoes the city itself, is found in the deepest Chalice dungeons as a boss. She is pregnant. Her pregnancy suggests that at some point, a Great One's child was conceived in or near the Pthumerian civilization, and the blood associated with that pregnancy became the source that the church eventually tapped. The church's blood ministration began as genuine medicine. The blood did heal. People with otherwise fatal conditions were cured. The church's reputation grew rapidly, and Yharnam became a destination for medical pilgrims from across the world, people seeking cures that conventional medicine could not provide. The pilgrims who came to Yharnam were warned, at least officially, that the treatment required them to stay in the city. Leaving before the treatment was complete was discouraged. What this meant in practice is that many people who came seeking healing found themselves essentially trapped in Yharnam as the transformations began. The blood ministration was not uniform. Different people responded differently to the blood, with some showing early bestial symptoms and others appearing to benefit for extended periods without obvious side effects. This variability made it difficult for even the church to predict or manage outcomes. The church developed a system of hunters, specifically to manage the beast problem. When blood recipients began to transform, hunters were dispatched to contain them. The existence of this management system was not publicized, and to residents of Yharnam, it was framed as a necessary response to a pre-existing beast problem, rather than as a consequence of the church's own medical practices. The choir, the upper echelon of the healing church, had a more complete picture of what the blood was doing and what it was for. The choir's research was not about healing, it was about ascension. The choir believed that the transformation process, properly managed, could produce beings capable of contacting or merging with the Great Ones. One of the choir's experiments involved exposing patients to the concentrated extracts of Great One presence, rather than diluted blood administration. These experiments were conducted in the upper cathedral ward, and the results are what you find there when you arrive in the game. The celestial emissaries and the ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, are both products of the choir's work. Ebrietas is a Great One herself, or a being close enough to Great One status to be treated as one. Her presence in the cathedral ward, in what appears to be a deliberate containment structure, suggests the choir succeeded in establishing contact and then was not sure what to do with what they found. Ebrietas' name and design suggests something genuinely cosmic and alien. She is one of the few entities in the game that appears to have some compassion or connection to the researchers who found her, perhaps because she was left behind by other Great Ones and found a kind of family in the humans who discovered her. The choir kept Ebrietas secret from most of the church hierarchy. The upper levels of the cathedral ward are inaccessible without specific items, and the enemies there are church officials who have transformed so completely that they no longer function as recognizable people. The secrecy was maintained, even as the secrecy became increasingly difficult to justify. The research hall in the Old Hunters DLC shows the conditions in which the choir conducted its patient experiments. The hall is full of transformed patients, some of whom appear to have developed additional sensory organs, specifically additional eyes, in a manner that the choir considered a sign of progress. The patients did not necessarily agree. The development of eyes in unusual locations in Bloodborne is consistently associated with insight and the perception of the higher planes. The enemies with eyes on their hands, the insight mechanic that literally changes what you see, the Great One's association with eyes, all of this points toward a cosmology in which vision is the primary sense through which the cosmic world is perceived. The orphanage, as mentioned earlier, was used to identify children with heightened insight potential. The church was not simply conducting these experiments on random subjects. They were specifically seeking people who could perceive things that most humans could not. And children were considered particularly promising because their perception had not yet been conditioned to reject the impossible. Adela, a nun you can encounter in the game, is one of the church's blood patients who has maintained enough of herself to speak and move through the world. Her fragility and her religious devotion are both genuine. She is a person who came to the church for healing, received it to some degree, and has oriented her entire remaining identity around gratitude to the institution that did this to her. Alfred is another church-associated character, this time from the Executioners faction rather than the main healing ministry. The Executioners were a healing church-affiliated group tasked with hunting those who had transgressed specific church laws, most notably those who made covenants with the Vile Bloods, a group the church considered heretical. The Vile Blood conflict is one of the law's more interesting political dramas. The Vile Bloods of Canehurst Castle possessed their own form of blood, which they collected from hunters who came to their castle. The church considered this blood impure and heretical, and the executioners were sent to Canehurst to destroy the Vile Blood Queen and her court. What the church did to Canehurst was a massacre. The executioners did not merely remove a theological rival, they destroyed an entire aristocratic court, and presumably everyone in it. By the time you arrive at Canehurst in the game, it is a frozen, abandoned castle, populated by spectral remnants, and a single surviving queen. Queen Annalise of the Vile Bloods survived by means that are not fully explained, but she is clearly not entirely alive in any conventional sense. She sits on her throne, largely non-responsive, and her primary function in the game is as a covenant vendor. Her history and her survival suggest something about the nature of the Vile blood that made its possessor difficult to permanently destroy. The executioner Alfred has spent his entire in-game existence hunting the Vile Bloods without knowing that the Queen survived. When you give him the information he needs to find her, his response is swift and brutal, and clearly the most fulfilling moment of his life. Whether that fulfillment is warranted or horrifying is again something the game lets you decide. The Healing Church's relationship to knowledge was fundamentally extractive. They sought knowledge about the Great Ones in order to reach them, but they did not share what they learned with the people who were transformed by that knowledge. The Blood Ministration's recipients were essentially research subjects who were told they were patients. The concept of informed consent is conspicuously absent from the church's operations. The choir's experimental patients, the orphans taken to the upper cathedral ward, the pilgrims who came seeking healing and received transformation, none of them appear to have been told the full scope of what was being done to them. This is not presented in the lore with heavy-handed moral commentary. You discover it through item descriptions and environmental evidence and the behavior of the characters you meet. The church's institutional evil is revealed quietly, accumulating detail by detail, which makes it more affecting than a more explicit condemnation would be. The Edon Writhe rune and the references to formless Edon throughout the game introduce one of the stranger entities in the lore. Edon is a great one who has no form. It exists only in its voice and in the blood of those who carry its essence. Several major characters in the game are, possibly without knowing it, carriers of Eden's child. The Edon Chapel area of the game is named for this entity, and it contains a significant NPC hub where several characters end up over the course of the game. The chapel's connection to a formless Great One of blood and voice feels appropriate, given that the entire lore of Yharnam is organized around blood as a medium of communication between humans and things greater than human. The Healing Church's theology was not wrong in its core insight. The Great Ones do exist. The blood does connect the human world to the cosmic one. The transformation is real. What the church got wrong, or chose to ignore, was the question of whether that connection was something to pursue or something to survive. The church clerics who transformed first, the people like Vicar Amelia who were closest to the sacrament, became the beast problem rather than the solution to it. Their transformation is the game's central demonstration that proximity to divine power without the capacity to process it does not produce transcendence. It produces monsters. The difference between the church's aspirations and the reality of what it produced is one of the things that makes Bloodborne so resonant. Every institution in the game that pursued power through knowledge ended up destroying the people it was supposed to serve. The church is the largest example of this, but it is not the only one. The choir's specific research focus, attempting to birth a Great One's child within a human vessel, is one of the darkest threads in the lore. The motivation was apparently to create a direct link between humanity and the Great Ones, a living connection that would elevate human perception permanently. What this project produced is visible in the game in the form of Murgo's wet nurse and in the Nightmare of Mensis, where the brain of Mensis sits broadcasting something terrible from its prison in a cage. The Mensa scholars who conducted this experiment gained something from it. It did not make them happy or elevated. It made them something else entirely. The School of Mensis is the third major faction in the game's intellectual landscape, alongside the Old Workshop and the Healing Church. The Mensis scholars were more extreme in their methods than the Church, willing to sacrifice their own minds in pursuit of contact with the Great Ones. Their headquarters in Murgo's Loft area tells this story through the bodies left behind. The various factions of Yharnam, the Church, the Mensis scholars, the executioners, the hunters, the Vilebloods, all pursued versions of the same underlying goal, which was understanding and connecting with something beyond the human world. They each had different methods and different theologies, and they all, in their different ways, failed. Chapter 3: Hunters, Weapons, and the Nature of the Hunt. The hunters of Yharnam were not a recent invention. The need to contain beast outbreaks predates the Healing Church's formalization of the hunting profession, suggesting that the transformation problem existed in some form even before the Church began distributing blood to the general population. The oldest hunters in the game's lore are connected to the workshop, which was established before the Church's institutional period. These hunters used practical mechanical weapons and appear to have had a more matter-of-fact relationship with their work than the later Church hunters, who developed elaborate theological justifications for the hunt. Hunter weapons in Bloodborne are designed to be transformable, folding into different configurations for different combat situations. This design philosophy is in lore as well as mechanical. The trick weapons represent a specifically Yharnamite approach to combat, practical and adaptable rather than conventionally heroic. The saw cleaver, the most basic of the starting weapons, is an industrial tool adapted for monster killing. Its design language tells you everything about the original hunter tradition. There is nothing sacred about it. It is a blade attached to a mechanism that can extend it, used by practical people doing a necessary and unpleasant job. The threaded cane, another starting weapon, points toward a different tradition of hunter, one that was more socially elevated and maintained the appearance of civilization, even while doing the work of the hunt. A walking cane that conceals a whip is the weapon of someone who needed to move through polite society as well as through beast-infested streets. The Kirk hammer, which pairs a dagger with a massive stone hammer inscribed with church symbols, is explicitly a weapon of the church hunter tradition. The duality of a small practical blade and a massive ritual hammer reflects the church's approach to the hunt as both physical work and sacred duty. The Holy Moonlight Sword, Ludwig's weapon, is one of the most significant weapons in the game's lore. Ludwig believed he saw something holy in the Moonlight Blade during a vision, and it became the foundation of his faith that the hunt had divine purpose. Whether his vision was real or a product of his blood consumption is left ambiguous. The Burial Blade, Gehrman's weapon, is described as a scythe made from siderite, a meteoric iron. The material alone marks it as connected to the sky and the cosmic rather than the earthly. Gehrman's weapon, being made from material that literally fell from above, is consistent with his role as the first hunter, a figure connected to something higher than the church's theology. The Chickajay is a weapon associated with the Vilebloods and with Eastern aesthetics that are unusual for Yharnam's generally Western European visual language. Its presence in the game introduces the possibility that the world of Bloodborne has other cities, other cultures, and other approaches to the same problem of blood and beasts that Yharnam faces. Lady Maria's weapon, the Rakuyo, also has Eastern design language, and her background, as described in the Old Hunters DLC, suggests she came to Yharnam from elsewhere, possibly from a distant noble family, and found in the Hunters a purpose she could commit to fully. The Tonitrus, a weapon that generates bolt damage through a mechanism of treated quicksilver and electrical input, is one of the most overtly scientific weapons in the game. Its design suggests that at least some hunters were approaching the beast problem empirically rather than religiously, seeking physical rather than divine solutions. The Holy Moonlight Swords. Description notes that it is a weapon that existed in the real world, but also does not exist which is one of those Bloodborne item descriptions that operates in multiple registers simultaneously, functioning as a weapon fact and also as a comment on the nature of faith and vision in the game's world. Hunters who consumed too much blood or spent too long on the hunt risked losing their humanity in a specific way that was different from the standard beast transformation. Some hunters became bewitched by the hunt itself, a state described as being drunk on blood echoes, becoming more efficient and ruthless, but losing their broader sense of self and purpose. The concept of the blood-drunk hunter is important enough that it becomes a boss fight, the blood-starved beast, and also the entire conceptual framework of the old Hunters DLC. The hunters trapped in the nightmare are there partly because of what they did to themselves and others through the hunt, not only because of what was done to them. Father Gascoigne is one of the most effective examples of a hunter who lost himself to the hunt. He is the first major boss in the game, a hunter you encounter who has already transformed into a beast, but whose humanity flickers back briefly when you use his music box, the one that plays a tune his daughter made for him. Gascoigne's story is told entirely through found items and environmental context, not through cutscenes or dialogue. His wife was killed by beasts, possibly by Gascoigne himself in a transformed state. His daughters are searching for their mother. The music box was the last thing tethering him to himself, and by the time you meet him, it is not enough. The music box mechanic in the Gascoigne fight is one of gaming's better examples of lore and gameplay integrating completely. Using it during the fight does not defeat him. It staggers him briefly, forcing a moment of recognition. But recognition is not salvation, and the fight continues. The game is telling you, in the most direct terms available to it, that connection alone cannot pull someone back from where Gascoigne has gone. The hunter's garb throughout the game encodes status and affiliation. The plain hunter garb suggests the older workshop tradition. The church-affiliated hunters wear more ornate clothing with religious symbolism. The Canehurst enemies wear aristocratic attire that has been adapted for combat. What you are wearing tells you whose tradition you belong to. The concept of the hunt itself is almost never questioned within the world of Yharnam. It is treated as a natural institution, something that has always happened and will always need to happen. This lack of questioning, this naturalization of violence as civic necessity, is itself one of the things the game's lore is examining. The hunters who came before you, represented by the graves in the hunter's dream, are not named or memorialized in any detail. They are simply present as evidence that others came before you and were consumed by the same process. The dream's cemetery of nameless hunters is one of the more quietly melancholy elements of the game's world. The player character, the hunter you control, is a specific case that the game's lore addresses obliquely. You came to Yharnam seeking treatment, signed a contract for a blood ministration at Iosefka's clinic, and then became a hunter. The details of how and why you became a hunter, rather than a patient, are part of the game's broader mystery about the nature of the hunter's dream and who controls entry to it. The moon presence, who is revealed to be the entity behind the hunter's dream and Gehrman's imprisonment within it, appears to have been selecting hunters for the dream for reasons connected to its own goals. What those goals are is one of the game's deepest questions, and the answer depends on which ending you pursue. The three endings of Bloodborne each represent a different answer to the question of what the hunter ultimately is and what happens to them. Gehrman's ending suggests acceptance of the hunt and the cycle. The moon presence ending suggests absorption into the same system that consumed the hunters before you. The true ending, the childhood ending, suggests something genuinely new. The true ending requires consuming 3 umbilical cords from children or infants of great ones, and it results in the hunter transforming into something entirely new, a newborn great one, a small and seemingly helpless form that Gehrman and the moon presence did not anticipate. Whether this transformation is a victory is genuinely unclear. You have escaped the cycle of the hunt, but you have also left behind whatever humanity you had. Gehrman's words before the final confrontation of the bad ending, when he asks to be allowed to release you from the dream, suggest he sees the true ending as something he could not have predicted and possibly fears. The doll weeps at the true ending. Her relationship to the hunter over the course of the game is one of quiet attendance and care, and her tears at the transformation suggest that whatever the player character has become, she recognizes the cost of it. The hunter's relationship to the Great Ones is mirrored in many of the NPC hunters you meet throughout the game. Eileen the Crow, who hunts other hunters who have lost themselves to the blood, represents a tradition of keeping the hunting profession accountable to itself. She is doing what hunters are supposed to do, just to hunters, rather than beasts. The hunter Jura, barricaded in Old Yharnam and defending the beasts there, represents the opposite extreme. He has concluded that the beasts are people, transformed but still deserving of protection, and he has removed himself from the church's system of authorized violence to act on that conclusion. Old Yharnam itself is significant. It is the part of the city that was burned in a previous beast plague, with the burning ordered by the church as a solution to the transformation problem. The scorched ruins and the presence of Jura suggest that this was not a unique event, but a recurring one, that Yharnam had gone through this cycle before. The fact that there was a previous beast plague severe enough to require burning a section of the city is one of the most quietly alarming pieces of information in the game. It means the church knew the blood caused this. They had seen it before. They chose to continue distributing the blood anyway. Chapter 4. The Great Ones and the Outer Cosmos. The Great Ones are the entities that define the outer edge of Bloodborne's cosmology. They are not gods in any conventional religious sense, though the factions of Yharnam treat them as such. They are, as far as the lore suggests, simply beings of a different order, older and larger and stranger than human experience can fully process. The game presents the Great Ones as genuinely alien in the most literal sense, not human enough in their fundamental organization to have understandable motivations or communications. What seems clear is that they exist on a plane that overlaps with the human world but does not coincide with it, and that human perception, when extended far enough through blood or insight, can begin to detect them. Amygdala is one of the first Great Ones you can encounter directly. It hangs from the lecture hall buildings, enormous and mostly invisible until you have enough insight to perceive it. When it becomes visible, it becomes interactive, and it is a teleporter as well as a boss. Its function in the game world is ambiguous, but its design is unmistakable. The design of Amygdala, a massive multi-limbed thing with a humanoid body and a face full of eyes, draws directly on the game's consistent visual language about eyes and perception. The entity that allows you to perceive more is itself defined by its eyes. This feels like a deliberate design choice rather than pure aesthetics. Rom, the vacuous spider, is a great one whose specific role in the lore is to maintain the veil that keeps the blood moon hidden from general perception. Her name, the vacuous spider, suggests something about her nature. She is massive but inert, maintaining a function rather than pursuing a goal, and her boss fight is one of the game's more peculiar encounters because of how passive she seems until you threaten the barrier she maintains. Killing Rom is a narrative hinge point in the game. It reveals the true state of the blood moon and advances the Murgo subplot significantly. The removal of Rom's veil is what allows you to perceive and then address the nightmare of Mensis, which has been operating in a hidden space adjacent to the waking city. The moon presence is the entity most directly connected to the hunter's dream and to the game's central framing. It appears to have established the dream as a mechanism for something, possibly for collecting the blood echoes of hunters, possibly for conducting its own experiments on what happens when humans pursue contact with the cosmic plane. The moon presence's motivation is, characteristically, not explained. What can be read into it is that it found something valuable in the hunter tradition, something worth sustaining and manipulating across potentially enormous spans of time. Gehrman's age and the number of hunter graves in the dream suggest this has been ongoing for a very long time. Murgo, the child of a great one whose cries define the nightmare of Mensis, is never directly seen. The wet nurse who guards the cradle from which Murgo's crying emanates is a boss, but Murgo itself is invisible. The suggestion is that Murgo may already be dead or exists in a state between death and life that the nightmare sustains. The loss of a Great One's child is described in item descriptions as the most significant source of cosmic grief in the game's lore. Several Great Ones appear to be defined by this loss, and their proximity to the human world seems connected to attempts, conscious or not, to replace what was lost through connection with humanity. The concept of a Great One reaching into the human world to seek a surrogate child is one of the most emotionally resonant ideas in the lore. It recasts the horror of the transformation process as a kind of desperate reaching, a cosmic entity trying to bridge a gap that cannot be bridged through the available means. Odom, the formless Great One mentioned earlier, exists only through the blood of its carriers. Several characters in the game are pregnant with or carrying Odin's child, most notably the character Ariana and the suspicious beggar NPC, who is connected to a series of NPC deaths if you place multiple characters in the chapel. The suspicious beggar's true nature, as a beast who poses as a human to feed on the blood of those around him, and his connection to Eden through the items he drops after his death, suggests that Eden's influence extends to things that are already partly transformed. The formless Great One works through the blood itself, regardless of whose body carries it. Celestial beings in the game, entities like the celestial emissaries and the fishing hamlet creatures, represent different stages or types of proximity to the Great Ones. The emissaries are humans who have been completely altered by the choir's experiments. The fishing hamlet creatures are the community that was used to access a Great One's corpse washing on their shores. The Great One whose corpse washed up on the fishing hamlet's shore is one of the lore's most significant narrative events. The old hunters, led by the researchers of the workshop, went to the hamlet and used the Great One's body and possibly its still living brain to conduct experiments in cosmic contact. What they did to the hamlet's people in the process is not described in full, and the omission is pointed. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote that whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent. Bloodborne seems to have taken a different approach. Its most horrifying events are the ones described most obliquely, where the space between what is said and what is implied is where the real horror lives. The fishing hamlet is the clearest example of this. Simon the Harrowed, the historian trapped in the nightmare, suggests through his dialogue that the hamlet's story was what brought him to Yharnam in the first place. He was researching the city's history and found the hamlet story and could not look away from it. His being trapped in the nightmare as a result suggests that knowing the truth of what happened there has its own costs. The brain of Mensis, encountered in the Nightmare of Mensis, is the most extreme example of what the Mensis scholars produced through their experiments. It is a massive, pulsing, nearly immobile organ with the vestigial remains of a human form. It was created by the scholars, placing a still-living human brain in proximity to the cosmic plane until the transformation was essentially total. The winter lanterns, the bell-ringing enemies found in the nightmare spaces, are understood by many community researchers to be what happens to hunters who have encountered too much insight without the capacity to process it. Their bell ringing connects to the ritual use of bells throughout the game, which is consistently associated with communication with the Great Ones or with the nightmare spaces. The concept of madness in Bloodborne is not framed as mental illness in any clinical sense. It is framed as a perceptual expansion that exceeds a person's ability to function within normal reality. The insight mechanic, where higher insight makes the game both harder and more revealing, is a direct mechanical expression of this concept. The item descriptions for Madman's knowledge and Great One's wisdom, the items you pick up to gain insight, treat knowledge as a physical substance. You consume it. This framing positions the acquisition of cosmic understanding as something bodily and invasive rather than something purely intellectual, which is consistent with the broader body horror aesthetic of the game. The doll's willingness to grant you power through her prayer at the insight cost of visiting the dream is one of the lore's quiet attentions. She is essentially administering the same service as the healing church's blood ministration, providing power in exchange for insight, for the cost of what you are slowly becoming. The lecture hall, a location that appears in the middle portion of the game and connects several areas through dimensional transitions, is one of the most explicitly academic settings in the game. It looks like a university lecture hall, with desks and blackboards, and the general atmosphere of an educational institution. Its contents are uniformly horrifying. The students in the lecture hall have been transformed by exposure to the higher planes into something that retains the form of scholars, but has lost everything that made them scholars. Their presence in the lecture hall suggests that academic pursuit of the cosmic was as dangerous as religious pursuit of it, just organized differently. The two versions of the lecture hall, accessed in different parts of the game, represent different stages of the same disaster. The first version has more intact enemies and furniture. The second version is further deteriorated, with more bodies and more evidence of what the final stages of the research produced. You move between them through a doorway that crosses between states of the same space. The Nightmare Frontier, a location connected to the lecture hall, is one of the game's stranger spaces. It has a poisonous atmosphere and a surreal geography, and it is inhabited by amygdalae and nightmare apostles, figures who have committed themselves entirely to the cosmic plane. Its function in the narrative is primarily to establish the scale of the nightmare spaces and the variety of things that end up in them. Chapter 5: The Nightmare Realms and What Lives There. The nightmare spaces in Bloodborne are not simply locations, they are states. The Hunter's Nightmare, the Nightmare Frontier, the Nightmare of Mensis. These are places that exist because something terrible needed somewhere to go, and the cosmic architecture of the world provided that somewhere. The Hunter's Nightmare specifically was created as a containment space for the worst of what the old hunters did. But it is not a clean separation. The people and things in it are still present in some sense, still experiencing what they experienced, still defined by the decisions that put them there. Ludwig's presence in the Hunter's Nightmare as a beast is the most prominent example of this. He was the first church hunter, the most significant figure in the formalization of the church hunting tradition, and he ended up in a nightmare space, transformed by the very blood he believed was sacred. The Simon subplot in the Old Hunters DLC establishes that the nightmare is not inaccessible to those outside it. Researchers, historians, people who've accumulated enough insight into what actually happened in Yharnam can find themselves drawn in. Simon is there because he knew too much. The nightmare's borders are determined by knowledge as much as by guilt. Lawrence, the first vicar, is found in the Hunter's Nightmare in an advanced bestial state, with a distinction that matters. His physical transformation retains a human upper body. He breathes fire, an unusual ability that connects to speculation about which Great One he was most closely associated with. The fire is consistent with descriptions of certain Great One attributes in item descriptions. The Nightmare of Mensis is the space associated with the School of Mensis's activities, and with Murgo specifically. It is architecturally similar to Yharnam in its ground-level sections, but becomes increasingly strange as you move toward the Murgo's loft area, where the nightmare sky is wrong and the architecture detaches entirely from anything recognizable. Mikolash, the host of the Nightmare of Mensis, is one of the game's more unusual boss encounters. He runs from you through a series of mirror maze rooms, shouting fragments of philosophy and pleading with you to let him keep his dream. He is, in a deeply sad way, happy to be in the nightmare. It gave him what he wanted. Mikolash's dialogue about granting eyes to the inside of his skull is one of the most quoted lines in the game's fandom, and for good reason. It is the clearest verbal expression of the Mensis scholar's ultimate goal: to develop the internal capacity for perception that would make contact with the Great Ones possible, not through external means, but through transformation of the self. The Mensis cage, the iron cage some Mensis scholars wear on their heads, is one of the game's stranger visual details. It appears to be a device for shielding the mind from whatever the brain of Mensis broadcasts, or possibly for filtering the contact, rather than preventing it. The scholars who wear them have clearly made some accommodation with the nightmare that others have not. The wet nurse who guards Murgo's cradle is one of the game's more visually striking bosses. It is a multi-armed entity in a nurse's uniform, appearing and disappearing within clouds of darkness, with the sound of infant crying constant throughout the fight. The wet nurse is doing its job. It is protecting a child. The horror of the fight comes from the contrast between the nursery role and the thing performing it. After killing the wet nurse and ending Murgo, the game treats this as a positive outcome. The crying stops, the blood moon begins to lift. The nightmare appears to be resolving. Whether this is genuinely positive, or whether it is a form of harm done to an entity that had already lost its parent, is one of those questions the lore plants and does not answer. The amygdalae that appear throughout the game in increasing numbers as the night progresses are not simply random monsters. Their appearance correlates with the state of the blood moon and with the permeability of the barrier between the waking world and the nightmare spaces. They are, in a sense, symptoms of what is happening cosmically rather than causes. The fact that the amygdalae are invisible to people with insufficient insight is important for understanding the game's progression. The world is becoming more permeable to the cosmic throughout the night. The hunters with highest insight have known this world was already there. Those without insight are experiencing a sudden, horrifying revelation. The nightmare spaces have their own internal logic. Things that should be dead are still present. Buildings exist in configurations that are physically impossible. Time appears to function differently, which is why the hunter's nightmare can contain people who should have died centuries ago. The connection between the nightmare spaces and the waking city of Yharnam is maintained through bells. The beckoning bell and the resonant bell mechanics in the game's multiplayer system are in-lore communications between the nightmare space and the waking world, a formalization of a connection that already exists and that the hunters have learned to exploit. The bloodletting beast found in the Chalice dungeons is one of the oldest transformed creatures in the game, a beast whose transformation appears to date from the Pthumerian era rather than the current night's events. Its presence in the dungeons, alongside other ancient creatures, establishes that the transformation process has been occurring in some form for an extremely long time. The dark beasts, particularly the dark beast Paul found in Old Yharnam, are electrically charged beasts whose transformation has progressed so far that they barely retain any recognizable animal form. They are among the oldest and most extreme transformations in the game above ground, and their electricity connects to the same lightning bolt imagery associated with certain great ones. The celestial minions, the crawling infant-like creatures found in late-game areas, are described in item descriptions as the children of the great ones, or as beings associated with them. Their appearance near the cosmic portal areas of the game suggests that the barrier has become thin enough for these entities to cross through. The baby's head rune, one of the more disturbing items in the game, is associated with the ritual use of infant forms for cosmic communication. The Mensis scholars' experiments with child subjects, the church's orphanage activities, and the presence of infant forms throughout the nightmare spaces all point toward a deeply uncomfortable recurring element in the lore. This element is not dwelt upon gratuitously in the game, but is consistently present. It suggests that the cosmic entities, the Great Ones, have a particular connection to or interest in early developmental states, possibly because early life represents the clearest form of the perceptual openness they value. The fishing hamlet's transformation, visible in the Old Hunters DLC, shows what happens to a community that is exposed to a Great One's remains over generations. The hamlet's people have partially transformed towards something aquatic and large-eyed, retaining recognizable humanoid structure, but clearly moving in a different direction from normal human development. The hamlet boss, Orphan of Kos, is the child of the Great One Kos, born after her death from her remains, and represents the most extreme form of loss in the game's cosmology. The orphan fights with the placenta it was still attached to, an image of violent birth and complete orphanhood, and its dying cry echoes the cries that the scholars who victimized its parent heard for the rest of their lives. The Orphan of Kos is one of the most difficult boss fights in the game, and the difficulty feels appropriate to the narrative context. You are not fighting a monster in any simple sense. You are encountering the consequences of what the old hunters did, manifested in the most direct and terrible form possible. The fishing hamlet at the end of the Old Hunters DLC is also where the DLC ends, which feels deliberate. After everything you have learned about the Old Hunters, and the Church, and the experiments, and the nightmare, the last thing you see is the place where it all started, where the original sin of the hunter tradition was committed. Chapter 6: Specific Characters and Their Fates. Eileen the Crow is one of the game's most fully realized NPCs, a hunter of hunters who operates independently of the church system, and whose quest line involves preventing other hunters from losing themselves to the blood madness before they become a danger to people. Eileen's design, with its crow feathers and distinctive mask, marks her as belonging to a tradition different from the church hunters. The Crow faction, or the League of Hunter-Hunters, is an old institution that predates the church and has maintained its independence from it, which is one reason it survived when the church's own ethical oversight mechanisms failed. Eileen's quest line can end in her death if you do not help her or if you wait too long between the key encounters. Her potential death is the game's way of showing you that the things worth preserving in Yharnam are fragile, that inaction has costs, and that even experienced hunters can be overwhelmed by what the night becomes. Alfred, as mentioned earlier, is one of the game's more tragic NPCs, because his tragedy is one of fulfilled purpose. He does exactly what he set out to do, kills the Vileblood Queen, and the item you receive from him after suggests he sacrificed himself in the process. He got what he wanted, and it destroyed him not because what he wanted was wrong by his own values, but because revenge, even righteous revenge, tends to consume the person who pursues it. Iosefka, the doctor at the clinic where you begin the game, has two versions. The real Iosefka is sympathetic, willing to help NPCs you send to her, providing useful items in exchange. The Oeska you eventually encounter in the clinic's interior, if you access it from behind, is an imposter who has taken over the clinic and is conducting choir-affiliated experiments on the patients who were sent there. The real Iosefka's fate is never explicitly shown, but the imposter's presence and the nature of the experiments suggest it was not good. The imposter herself is in an advanced state of transformation by the time you reach her, and her dialogue is a mix of genuine scientific enthusiasm and a complete absence of ethical consideration for the patients she has transformed. The plain doll is perhaps the character the player interacts with most in the game, as the mechanism through which you level up. Her origin, as noted earlier, is connected to Lady Maria, whose likeness was used to create her. The doll's status as a created being who has developed genuine inner life is something the game treats with care. The doll's lines about having no memories before coming to the dream, and her gentle manner throughout the game create an unusual emotional register. She is there to serve a function, but she is also clearly something more than a function. Whether her affection for the hunter is genuine or programmed is not something the game resolves. The doll's relationship to Lady Maria is one of the more affecting things in the game once you have played the Old Hunters DLC and understand what Lady Maria was. The doll is a kind of after-image of a real person, with none of Maria's history and all of her face. What that means for questions of identity and continuity is not addressed, but is implicitly present. Gehrman's imprisonment in the dream is one of the most important things to understand about the game's backstory. He did not choose to be there. He was taken by the moon presence and has been maintaining the dream's functions and training hunters ever since, for an indeterminate period that appears to be very long. The wheelchair is a detail that points toward Gehrman's history. He lost his leg at some point, most likely in combat, and the injury has not healed despite the dream's nominally restorative properties. This suggests the dream restores you to a baseline that it determined when you arrived, and Gehrman's baseline already included the missing leg. Gehrman's attitude toward the hunter over the course of the game is a mixture of genuine mentorship and suppressed desperation. He wants to be released. He knows only the hunter can release him. He cannot simply ask, because doing so would destabilize the system the moon presence requires him to maintain. The combat with Gehrman at the first ending is one of gaming's sadder boss fights. You are fighting an old man in a wheelchair who transforms into something more capable when the fight demands it, but the transformation is clearly difficult for him. And the fight ends with him talking about the grass and the morning sky, as though he has not seen them in a very long time. The moon presence is intervention after Gehrman's death in the first ending, absorbing the hunter into the dream as the new caretaker, is the game's simplest bad ending, not because it is the worst outcome, but because it is the most closed. The cycle continues. You have become what Gehrman was, and the next hunter will find you, sitting in the same wheelchair. Jura's history includes a period of conventional, church-affiliated hunting before his disillusionment. What changed his perspective is not fully explained in dialogue or items, but the fact that he positioned himself in Old Yharnam, the burned district, and has remained there defending the surviving beasts, suggests the burning was the event that turned him. The relationship between Old Yharnam and its burning is something Jura carries personally. He was there. Whether he participated in the burning, watched it, or arrived after the fact to find the survivors is unclear, but his commitment to protecting those survivors suggests a deep personal guilt or moral commitment that predates his current position. Patches the Spider, found in Chalice Dungeons and later in the Old Hunters DLC, is a version of the recurring Patches character from other From Software games. In Bloodborne, he is a half-transformed creature, part spider, but clearly still human in cognition, who navigates the nightmare spaces with a self-interested practicality that is both amusing and slightly horrifying given the context. The merchant woman in Central Yharnam, who sells basic items from behind her window, is one of the game's early contacts with the civilian population. Her terror is palpable. She knows something is wrong tonight, even if she does not know everything. Her advice to wait for morning is the last reasonable advice anyone in Yharnam offers, and it is also completely useless. The drunken man at the beginning of the game, who briefly wakes up and then dies, functions as a kind of calibration for the game's world. He is an ordinary person who has been caught in something extraordinary and has made peace with it through alcohol. His end is the game's first confirmation that Yharnam is not going to be safe tonight. The suspicious beggar, who can be placed in the chapel safe room with other NPCs, is one of the game's more disturbing social puzzles. Placing NPCs in the chapel creates a situation where if you complete his questline without awareness of his nature, you will return to find the NPCs dead. The social act of connecting a vulnerable person with a community turns out to have enabled a predator. The framing of this as a player failure rather than an NPC failure is one of the game's harder moral lessons. You did not know. You were trying to help. The game does not relent. Trying to help without full information has consequences, and the consequences fall on people who trusted you. Chapter 7. Blood, Transformation, and the Biology of Beasts. The beast transformations in Bloodborne follow patterns that point toward a consistent underlying biology, even as the specific outcomes vary enormously. Understanding these patterns helps clarify what the blood is actually doing to the people who receive it, as opposed to what the church said it was doing. The basic transformation involves the gradual overexpression of animal characteristics. Hunters and civilians who have taken large amounts of blood begin to show increased size, increased hair growth, clawed hands, and behavioral changes that move toward predatory instinct and away from higher cognitive function. This is the standard beast model. What causes the transformation to accelerate or slow appears to depend on several factors, including the source of the blood, the amount consumed, the individual's existing insight level, and possibly their emotional state. Characters who are in states of intense grief or rage appear to transform more rapidly, suggesting a neurological or psychological component. The beast disease, as the church publicly framed it, is not a disease in any conventional sense. There is no infection vector in the bacterial or viral sense. The transformation is a property of the blood itself, and exposure to the blood is the only mechanism identified in the law for triggering it. However, the game also contains evidence of people transforming without obvious blood consumption, specifically in areas far from the church's ministration network. This suggests either that the blood has spread into the environment through water or soil, or that proximity to transformed individuals has its own gradual effect. The pigs in Central Yharnam and the Forbidden Woods area have clearly consumed human remains and are transforming as a result. This creates an interesting secondary transmission vector. The beasts eat people, the pigs eat the beasts, the pigs begin transforming, and so on. The blood, or the properties of the blood, propagates through the food chain. The clerics who transformed into the giant cleric beasts appear to have experienced a more complete transformation than the standard beast, retaining some degree of intelligence and environmental awareness while losing most human behavior. The Cathedral Ward's cleric beast, the game's first boss, is large enough that it can only be fought outdoors, suggesting a transformation of truly extreme scale. The Great One influence on transformation is most visible in the Loran dark beasts and in the celestial creatures. These are not simply beasts in the standard sense, but entities that have moved further along the transformation curve towards something that is neither human nor beast, but something genuinely third. The bloodletting beast in the Chalice dungeons is notable because its transformation appears to have split or bifurcated. Its outer form is a standard massive beast. Cutting it open reveals a parasitic or secondary entity within the body that may represent a partially transformed brain or another consciousness that has taken up residence in the host body. The brain in the bloodletting beast is one of the more disturbing images in the Chalice dungeons, which is saying something. It pulses and reacts independently of the host body, suggesting that the transformation process can produce internal differentiation. The different parts of a transforming body can go in different directions simultaneously. The fishing hamlet's transformation is in a different category from the standard beast transformation. The hamlet's people appear to have transformed towards something aquatic rather than something predatory and mammalian. The influence here comes from proximity to Kos rather than from the church's blood, and the result is distinct enough to suggest that different Great Ones produce different transformation trajectories. The celestial transformation, visible in the choir's patients, is different again. These individuals have developed additional sensory organs, particularly eyes, and have become less physically threatening than the beasts, while being much more cognitively altered. The celestial emissaries are passive and gentle, until provoked, which is consistent with the idea that they have been transformed towards something that is more perceptive and less aggressive than baseline humanity. The brain of Mensis represents the absolute endpoint of the transformation toward insight, at least the endpoint achievable within the physical constraints of a human body. It is almost entirely cognitive and almost entirely helpless as a mobile entity. Its only active power appears to be broadcasting something that induces frenzy in those who look at it, suggesting that even in its transformed state, it poses a profound danger to normal human perception. The frenzy mechanic in the game, which fills a bar but instantly kills you if it fills completely, is associated with exposure to the higher planes, with the brain of Mensis, with the Winter Lanterns, and with certain Great One entities. Frenzy is the game's representation of perception, outrunning the capacity to process what you perceive. The frenzy bar can be reduced by items and by the sedatives, which in lore terms likely represent compounds that suppress the perceptual intensity, long enough for the character to regain equilibrium. The fact that these are called sedatives rather than anything that sounds medical or religious suggests their origin in practical chemistry rather than theology. The effects of blood on the mind rather than just the body are one of the lore's more subtle threads. Characters who have consumed large amounts of blood do not simply become physically larger or more animal. They become more driven, more single-minded, more capable of intense focus. This is partly what makes the blood-drunk hunters so dangerous. The blood's enhancement of focus and drive, combined with its gradual erosion of empathy and broader social cognition, produces exactly the kind of hunter that is most effective in the short term and most dangerous in the long term. The blood makes you better at hunting right up until the point where hunting is all you are. The vile blood's blood, the impure blood that the church declared heretical, appears to work on a different mechanism from the church's blood. Its primary effect seems to be preservation, keeping Queen Annalise in a state of undeath that resists destruction, rather than transformation in the direction of beast or cosmic. This difference is one reason the church's condemnation of it may have been partly competitive rather than purely theological. The 3 umbilical cords required for the true ending each come from a different source. One is from the Mensis scholar's contact with Murgo. One is from Ariana, if she delivers her child. One is from the Upper Cathedral Ward experiments. Each represents a different mode of contact between the human world and the Great Ones, and consuming all three gives the hunter's body the material basis for its own transformation into something new. The transformation in the true ending produces a small, almost infant-like form. This is consistent with the game's repeated association of Great One proximity with childlike or fetal states. The new form appears helpless, but has survived everything the game has thrown at it, and Gehrman and the Moon Presence are clearly unprepared for it. Chapter 8: The Chalice Dungeons and Pthumerian History. The Chalice Dungeons are the most mechanically distinct and narratively oldest part of Bloodborne. They represent the subterranean remnants of the Pthumerian civilization, the precursor culture to Yharnam, and they contain some of the lore's most important backstory. Accessing the Chalice Dungeons requires specific rituals involving the chalices themselves, which are artifacts that serve as keys to the subterranean architecture. The ritual nature of this access suggests that the Pthumerians designed the dungeons to require a specific form of knowledge to enter, not merely physical force. The depth levels of the Chalice Dungeons, from the basic Pthumeru through to the Great Pthumeru Ihil, correspond to increasing proximity to the Pthumerian civilization's most sacred and most secret sites. The deepest dungeons contain the most significant bosses and the most important architectural evidence of what the Pthumerians believed and practiced. The Keeper of the Old Lords, found in certain Chalice dungeons, is a flame-using enemy whose design suggests a high-ranking Pthumerian official with a specific function related to maintaining something or guarding it. The flame connection is consistent across several Pthumerian-associated elements and raises questions about which Great One's influence was most present in Pthumerian culture. The Watchers, the recurring enemy type found throughout the Chalice dungeons, appear to be Pthumerian guardians who have remained at their posts for an indeterminate, but clearly very long time. Their continued presence and continued function suggest that either the Pthumerian transformation process was so complete that it removed the need for rest, or that some other mechanism maintains them. The bloodletting beast's presence in the deeper dungeons, as noted, shows the oldest transformations in the game. Whatever happened to that entity happened before the church existed, before Yharnam as we know it existed, in the deep time of the Pthumerian civilization's relationship with the Great Ones. The undead giant bosses found in various configurations in the Chalice dungeons are simpler entities than the bloodletting beast, but no less ancient. They are massive, chained, and modified with weapons attached directly to their bodies. The chaining and modification suggests they were used as guardians or weapons by the Pthumerians, their transformation directed and exploited, rather than simply endured. The presence of chains and deliberate modification in the Chalice dungeon enemies is one of the more unsettling aspects of Pthumerian culture. They were not only worshipping the Great Ones and receiving their transformation, they were actively using transformed individuals as tools, integrating them into the dungeon's defensive architecture. The Loran Dark Beasts appear in the Chalice dungeons in forms that suggest they originated in a region or civilization called Loran, which is referenced in item descriptions as a place that was consumed by the beast plague before Yharnam. Loran is a cautionary tale that predates Yharnam's own experience of the same disaster. Loran, as the lore describes it, appears to have been a Pthumerian successor civilization or neighbouring culture that attempted to access Great One connection through the blood and suffered the predictable consequences. The Loran Dark Beasts in the Chalice dungeons are what remained preserved in the subterranean architecture long after Loran itself was gone. The lost and uncanny versions of weapons found in the Chalice dungeons have different gem slots than their standard counterparts, suggesting they were either made in the Pthumerian era using different craft traditions, or modified by Pthumerian or Chalice-dwelling entities for purposes that differ from the weapon's original intent. The bosses, exclusive to the Chalice dungeons, include some of the game's most significant encounters. The Pthumerian Descendant, with its fast and aggressive fighting style, suggests a warrior tradition within Pthumerian culture, quite different from the scholarly or priestly traditions suggested by other chalice enemies. The Yharnam, Pthumerian queen boss, found at the deepest level of the Pthumeru Ihil dungeon, is one of the game's most striking visual designs. She is tall, pale, and pregnant, and she fights using blood magic of considerable power. Her pregnancy is the central lore fact here. The child she carries is connected to Murgo's story and to the broader narrative of Great One children and their significance. The Blood Queen's presence in the deepest dungeon is a kind of origin point for everything the Church built its power upon. The blood connection that the Church formalized and distributed began with her, or with what she carried and what leaked from that carrying into the environment and the water supply, and eventually into the blood ministry. The chalice dungeon architecture itself contains narrative information in its design. The deeper dungeons are more elaborate, more ornate, and more clearly sacred in their intent. The altar structures, the flame pits, the ritual spaces, all suggest a living religious practice rather than simply a storage facility. The treasure rooms in the chalice dungeons, which require the sinister chalice variants, contain items and encounters that suggest these spaces were also used for the storage of important materials, possibly the most powerful blood variants, possibly artifacts of Pthumerian significance, in locations accessible only to those with the correct ritual knowledge. The Hill Root Chalice, the deepest procedurally generated dungeon type, produces environments that the game engine assembles from Pthumerian architectural elements, in combinations that suggest the generative principles underlying all Pthumerian design. The aesthetics remain consistent, even as the specific configurations vary, which is itself a kind of lore evidence for a coherent Pthumerian design tradition. The gem system in the chalice dungeons, which provides the most powerful versions of the blood gems used to upgrade weapons, has a lore dimension as well. Blood gems are described as the crystallization of blood properties into a physical form, and the strongest gems are found in the oldest and deepest dungeons, suggesting that the Pthumerian transformation process produced physical artifacts of unusual power. The Hintertome and Is Chalice branches, which are less central to the main dungeon narrative, contain environmental evidence of other aspects of Pthumerian life and death. The Is dungeons in particular, with their celestial inflected design language, suggest a Pthumerian religious tradition that included observation of and contact with the sky and the cosmic, not only the subterranean. The Is gravestone chalice's name points toward Is as a specific place or concept in Pthumerian cosmology, associated with death and burial, but also with celestial navigation. The combination of grave imagery and star imagery is consistent with many real-world ancient religious traditions that connected death with astronomical movement. The Great Is Chalice dungeon contains Ebrietas as its final boss, which is significant. Ebrietas, in the Chalice dungeon context, predates the Church's discovery of her in the cathedral ward. She was already present in the Pthumerian ritual spaces, suggesting that the Church's encounter with her was a rediscovery rather than an original contact. Chapter 9. Side Characters and Overlooked Stories. The storytelling in Bloodborne is distributed across characters who are easy to miss, items that require careful reading, and conversations that only happen if you meet very specific conditions. Some of the game's most affecting stories are told through characters who are only present for a few moments. The Gilbert NPC, found behind a window in Central Yharnam, is a man who came to Yharnam as a medical pilgrim and has been there long enough to know the city well. He has contracted the beast illness and is fighting to maintain his humanity. His practical advice and his quiet, steady demeanor make him one of the game's most sympathetic presences. Gilbert's transformation progresses over the course of the night. By the time you return to him late in the game, he is fully transformed. But his transformation is not aggressive or sudden. It is the conclusion of a process he was aware of and tried to manage, and the item he leaves for you suggests a degree of preparation and care for your well-being that he maintained even as he lost himself. The choir girl found in the cathedral ward, or the reference to the choir in general, points toward a population within the church that was specifically selected for hearing or voice quality and exposed to Great One communications through song or sound. Sound is an underexplored dimension of the Great One cosmology in Bloodborne, given Odin's nature and the significance of bells, but it is present throughout. The caged women in the witchcraft section of the Forbidden Woods, the winter lanterns in the nightmare spaces, and the augur of Ebrietta's spell that summons tentacles suggest that the ways in which the Great Ones communicate with or through humans involve a variety of sensory channels. The totality of this communication is understood by very few characters in the game. The small girl who asks you to find her mother at the beginning of the game represents the non-hunter civilian population of Yharnam in its most vulnerable form. Finding her mother's brooch elsewhere in the game confirms the mother's fate. What happens to the girl depends on your choices, but none of the outcomes are entirely positive. The note left by a father in Central Yharnam, asking the reader not to tell his daughter what happened to her mother, is one of the game's briefest and most effective pieces of environmental storytelling. You find it in a house. You have already encountered what happened to the mother. The note is asking for a protection that no longer makes sense, but that the father needed to imagine providing. The various NPCs who can be sent to the chapel or to Iosefka's clinic demonstrate the game's interest in the question of how you should behave toward vulnerable people in a crisis. The correct answers are not always obvious. Some characters who seem trustworthy are not. Some who seem dangerous are simply scared. The Adela questline, specifically the way it intersects with the Ariana questline, if you follow both simultaneously, shows how competing needs can produce irresolvable conflict. Adela is capable of violence against Ariana if Ariana is allowed to stay in the same safe space, and the specific nature of her jealousy connects to the blood and the theological dimensions of the character's situations. The skeptical man who refuses to come with you in Central Yharnam, insisting it is safer where he is, represents a population of people who made a reasonable decision based on limited information, and were wrong. He is not foolish, he is simply not a hunter, and the standards for survival on this night are beyond what any reasonable person could have predicted. The various mail and notes scattered throughout the game's world trace the history of specific families and households. Through the crisis, they are love letters, warnings, instructions, and farewells. They establish that the people of Yharnam had full lives before the night of the hunt, which makes the current state of the city more than simply a horror setting. It is a catastrophe. The Stump of Willem, where Alfred's questline reaches its resolution if you give him the unopened summons, is one of the quieter locations in the game, but one of the most loaded. Willem, the head of the Bergenworth scholars, is found here as an ancient man in a rocking chair, apparently having been there a very long time. Provost Willem of Bergenworth was the teacher of both Lawrence and of the researchers who developed the church's blood theology. His role in the game's lore is as the originating intellectual figure of the entire project, the one who first pursued the idea that eyes within the mind were the path to the higher planes. Willem's fate, sitting immobile in a rocking chair at the edge of the lake, where Rome maintains the veil, suggests that he reached some end point of his own inquiry and stopped. Whether this is tranquility or despair, or something else entirely, is not communicated clearly. He is simply there, old and still, at the edge of the waters that keep the blood moon hidden. Bergenworth itself, the abandoned school where Willem taught, contains the evidence of the scholars' early experiments and their gradual fracturing into competing factions. The Mensis scholars, the choir, the hunters, all have roots in Bergenworth, and the school's abandonment marks the point where the unified project of understanding the Great Ones dissolved into its various competing successors. The Library of Bergenworth contains books and documents that point toward the scholarly tradition the institution once represented. What Willem taught was not immediately theological. It began as genuine academic inquiry into the nature of the subterranean ruins and the entities associated with them. The theology came later, as the implications of the findings became clear. The connection between Bergenworth and the fishing hamlet is where the academic tradition became something else. The decision to go to the hamlet, to take what was there, To use the hamlet's people as subjects for experimentation was not a decision made by naive academics following intellectual curiosity wherever it led. It was a choice, made by people who knew it was wrong and made it anyway. Lady Maria's involvement in the fishing hamlet is one of the most significant biographical facts about her, and her response to it is what defines her character. She was there, she did what was done, and then she spent the rest of her life in self-imposed exile because she could not find a way to undo what had been done, or to forgive herself for having participated. The astral clock tower, where you find her in the Old Hunters DLC, is a tower she sealed herself into. The clocks are described as having been thrown into the tower, astronomical instruments she had accumulated through her travels. The tower full of clocks suggests someone marking time, waiting for something, or simply unable to move on. The story of Bloodborne's most important characters is in almost every case a story about people who pursued something they believed in and discovered that the pursuit itself had costs they had not anticipated or had chosen not to see. Maria, Ludwig, Lawrence, Gehrman, Willem, all of them followed a path that seemed worth following and arrived somewhere they had not intended. Chapter 10. The World Beyond Yharnam. The game's focus on Yharnam can create the impression that Yharnam is the only relevant location in its world, but the lore contains substantial evidence that the world is larger and that other places have their own relationships with the Great Ones and with blood. Cainhurst, the aristocratic castle to the northwest of Yharnam, is the clearest other location in the game with a developed identity. The Vilebloods originated there, and the architecture and aesthetic of Cainhurst is deliberately different from Yharnam's, suggesting a distinct cultural tradition, more courtly and less industrial, that developed its own relationship with unusual blood. The Eastern design language of certain weapons, particularly the Chikage and the Raita Palash and the Rakuyo, suggests that regions with different aesthetic traditions exist in the same world. The Rakuyo comes from a context described as Eastern, and Lady Maria's background connects her to a distant noble family, suggesting she travelled to Yharnam from somewhere with different cultural conventions. The mention of Loran as a previous civilization that was consumed by the Beast Plague establishes that Yharnam is not the first city to face this problem. Loran's ruins in the Chalice Dungeons suggest it was comparable in scale to Yharnam, perhaps larger, and that it fell into identifiable. The world that Bloodborne implies has been dealing with the consequences of Pthumerian contact with the Great Ones for an extremely long time. The blood has been circulating through what people eat and drink and breathe for long enough that the baseline for human experience in this world may already be different from what we would consider normal. The foreign students and travellers at Bergenworth suggest an international academic community that had interest in the Pthumerian discoveries. Not everyone who came to study these things was from Yharnam or its immediate region. The knowledge was spreading, and with it, the interest in what the blood could do. The pilgrim population who came to Yharnam for medical treatment represents an international population of sick people who were aware of the Church's reputation for healing at a distance. The Church's blood healing must have been known and trusted well beyond Yharnam's borders for this to produce the volume of pilgrims the game implies. The spread of the blood healing ministry beyond Yharnam is not shown in the game but is implied by the pilgrim population and by references to the Church sending blood and possibly ministers to other regions. If the Church's blood reached other cities and towns in the same concentrated form it was distributed in Yharnam, the night of the hunt may not be limited to Yharnam itself. The game does not address what is happening outside Yharnam during the night of the hunt, which is itself an interesting narrative choice. The game's scope is Yharnam and its dream spaces, and everything beyond is background. But the background implies a world that is watching what happens in Yharnam with considerable interest and concern. The moon over Yharnam, as described, is not normal, but the moon is a shared resource. If the blood moon is visually anomalous enough that it would be noticed from a distance, then people outside Yharnam know that something significant is happening. Whether they can or would intervene is another question. The architecture of Yharnam shows influence from multiple European traditions, suggesting that in the game's world history, Yharnam had contact with and possibly absorbed immigrants from various cultures. The Latin inscriptions, the Germanic architecture, the elements that recall both Prague and Edinburgh, all suggest a city that grew through exchange as much as through indigenous development. Chapter 11. The Hunt as Ritual and the Night as Event. The night of the hunt is not a regular occurrence in any simple sense. The game takes place during a hunt that has become something different from the routine beast containments that the Church managed over previous decades. The specific night of the game is one in which the cosmic situation has reached a crisis point. Murgo's cries are intensifying. The blood moon is rising. The Mensis scholars have completed their ritual. The nightmare spaces are more permeable than they have been before. Everything is converging. The regular hunts, the ones Yharnam experienced before this night, were managed crises. The Church knew the blood caused transformations, dispatched hunters to contain the resulting beasts, maintained enough secrecy that the public did not panic, and continued the blood ministration. This had been the rhythm of Yharnam's life for a long time. What changed was the accumulation of things that could not be contained. Too many transformations. The Mensis ritual. The deepening of the nightmare. The Church hierarchy's own transformation into the beasts they were supposed to hunt. The system failed all at once rather than gradually. And the night of the game is when that failure became total. The bells that ring throughout the hunt have ritual significance beyond the multiplayer mechanics. Bells in Yharnam are associated with the Church's practices, and their ringing on the night of the hunt suggests that somewhere, somehow, the ritual is still being performed, even as the ritual's practitioners are transforming. The bell-ringing women found throughout the game, the enemies who summon additional attackers through their bells, are understood to be part of a covenant or faction that serves the nightmare spaces directly. They ring bells that call beings from the nightmare into the waking world, inverting the protective function that bells might conventionally serve. The idea that protective symbols and rituals can be inverted by sufficient proximity to the cosmic horror is one of Bloodborne's recurring themes. The Church's blood was healing before it was transforming. The hunt was protective before it was catastrophic. The bells called the faithful before they called the nightmare. The same symbols serve different masters depending on what has most power over them. The lanterns that serve as checkpoints in the game are in-law connections to the hunter's dream, places where the boundary between waking Yharnam and the dream is thin enough to permit transit. Their distribution throughout the city suggests that the Church or the workshop established these connection points deliberately, treating the dream as a resource to be made accessible to hunters in the field. The candles that appear throughout Yharnam, in windows and on altars, and alongside roads, suggest either a genuine religious practice of illumination or a practical response to a night that is darker than normal. In the context of the blood moon, the candles take on a desperate quality, small fires against a transformed sky. The bodies hanging from lampposts and buildings throughout Central Yharnam are evidence of both beast-related deaths and mob violence. The citizens of Yharnam, before losing control of themselves, clearly organized some kind of improvised response to the initial transformation events. The bodies suggest both victims and executioners, people who fought back and people who were caught. The torches carried by the mob enemies in Central Yharnam mark them as people in the earlier stages of transformation, or simply people who are terrified and have armed themselves with whatever was available. Their hostility to the player is not mysterious. A stranger appearing in the streets on the night of the hunt is a threat. But it is tragic. They are still people trying to survive. The transformation of mob enemies as the night progresses. Their behavioral changes between early and late game if the game had a dynamic time element, which it does not mechanically but implies narratively, would follow the same curve as the blood's effects. The early hunt was people with torches and axes. The later hunt would be something else. Chapter 12. Music, Sound, and the Cosmic Register. The music of Bloodborne is not incidental to its lore. The soundtrack makes specific compositional choices that reflect the game's cosmological structure, and certain musical themes are associated with specific entities or states in ways that complement the visual and textual lore. The use of choir and orchestral elements throughout the game reflects the church's influence on the city's aesthetic. A city dominated by a religious institution that uses choral ritual would logically develop musical traditions that emphasize choral sound. The game's score adopts and then distorts that aesthetic as the cosmic elements of the story become more prominent. The cleric beast's music introduces a male chorus that becomes a recurring sonic signature for the beast transformations. There is something deliberately wrong about using choir music for a monster encounter, wrong in a way that points toward the church's complicity in creating the beast problem. The sacred aesthetic has become the horror aesthetic. Lady Maria's boss theme is one of the most purely musical pieces in the game, a harpsichord-led composition that suggests the cultured, aristocratic background of the character before introducing more agitated and finally desperate elements. The musical biography of the character in the theme is one of the DLC's most efficient pieces of characterization. The winter lanterns emit a humming sound that is one of the game's more genuinely unsettling audio designs. The hum is slightly off-pitch in a way that is difficult to localize, seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and the effect it has on the frenzy meter is mirrored by an uncomfortable physical response in many players. Sound design, as a direct nervous system stimulus, is something Bloodborne uses deliberately. The church bells throughout the game produce sounds at different pitches and rhythms, depending on which area you are in, creating a kind of ambient notation of the hunt's progress. The bells of Cathedral Ward sound different from the bells of the nightmare spaces, and the difference encodes something about the space's relationship to the waking and dreaming worlds. The cries of Murgo that permeate the Nightmare of Mensis are an unusual sound design choice because they are the cries of something that may not exist, or exists in a state between life and death. The absence of any visible source for the crying, combined with its omnipresence in the space, creates a particular kind of dread that is specific to sound unmoored from its source. The sound of the doll's voice, calm and slightly formal throughout the game, contrasts with the ambient horror of everything around her. The hunter's dream is not silent. There are environmental sounds, but the doll's presence in it creates a specific acoustic register of stillness that marks the dream as different from both waking Yharnam and the nightmare spaces. The Old Hunters DLC introduces a music box tune that Lady Maria's grandmother gave to her, which was then given to the doll, which was then reproduced by Maria's daughter in Gascoigne's story. The same melody connects multiple generations and multiple forms of memory and loss, functioning as an acoustic thread through several of the DLC's most affecting moments. The sound of blood, the wet impact of the game's combat, is one of the most effective audio choices in the game. It is neither sanitized nor gratuitous, calibrated to communicate the physical reality of the hunt without becoming noise. The combat audio is the most grounded element of the sound design, a practical counterpoint to the more abstract and cosmic sonic vocabulary used in boss and nightmare spaces. The ambient sound of beasts in areas where they are not yet visible is one of the game's most effective uses of audio as lore delivery. You hear something before you see it. The sound tells you something is wrong before the visual confirms what kind of wrong. The sensory sequencing mirrors the game's broader epistemology. You sense the great ones before you can see them. You hear the transformation before you understand it. Chapter 13. The Firearms and Their Place in the Lore. The firearms in Bloodborne are like the trick weapons, specific to the Yharnam hunting tradition, and reflect the city's industrial development as much as its religious one. Guns in Bloodborne are not primarily damage dealers. They are tools for interrupting the rhythm of combat, for breaking an enemy's guard at a specific moment, which reflects how the hunters think about firearms. The hunter's pistol and hunter's blunderbuss are the two starting firearms, and their mechanical differences in the game reflect a lore distinction. The pistol is a precision instrument for hunters who are willing to invest in careful positioning. The blunderbuss is a crowd control tool for hunters who deal with multiple opponents regularly. The Ludwig's rifle, despite its name suggesting a church connection, is primarily a practical weapon with an unusual double-barrel configuration that allows for a quicksilver bullet barrage. Ludwig's approach to the hunt was systematic and thorough, and a weapon that can deliver more projectiles faster reflects that systematic quality. The Evelyn, a weapon associated with the Cainhurst tradition, fires the most powerful single shots of any standard firearm and is refined in a way that reflects the aristocratic aesthetic of its origin. It is a lady's weapon by design language, which carries certain implications about who is expected to use it, but it is also genuinely the most powerful single-shot option available. The church cannon, the heaviest firearm, requires a very particular physical position to fire and delivers enormous damage at the cost of considerable commitment. It is a weapon that trusts in the impact over maneuverability, which reflects something about the church hunter's general approach. The authority of the institution behind the violence matters as much as the violence itself. The bow blade, a weapon from the Old Hunters DLC, is unique in that it bridges the trick weapon and the firearm categories. It functions as a close-range weapon in one form and as a ranged bow-type weapon in another, using quicksilver arrows rather than bullets. Its design language suggests a hunting tradition that predates the firearms era of Yharnam's development. The cannon, separate from the church cannon, is found as a consumable or equipable item in the Chalice dungeons, suggesting that the Pthumerians had their own equivalents of explosive or ballistic weaponry. The Pthumerian versions are less refined than the Yharnamite firearms, but reflect the same underlying principle of delivering force at a distance. The use of quicksilver as the primary ammunition material throughout the game is consistent with Quicksilver's real-world associations with mercury and with alchemical and medicinal traditions that treated mercury as a powerful and dangerous substance. In Bloodborne's world, Quicksilver has been identified as effective against the beasts because of properties connected to the blood or to the Great Ones, which is not fully explained. The Hunter tools, which function as the game's equivalent of magic spells, are not firearms, but represent a similar kind of extended reach. They channel properties connected to the Great Ones. The Augur of Ebrietas calls on Ebrietas' power. The empty phantasm shell coats weapons in arcane properties. And the Executioner's gloves throws bolts of lightning associated with Logarius. Chapter 14. Locations outside the main path. The optional areas of Bloodborne contain some of the game's most significant lore, and the decision to make them optional rather than mandatory reflects a specific narrative philosophy. The most important things you learn in Yharnam are the things you pursue, rather than the things you are handed. Cainhurst Castle is only accessible through a specific item found in a specific location after a specific NPC interaction, and its lore significance to the Vileblood conflict and to the Executioners is enormous. The fact that it is easy to miss means many players complete the game without the full context for Alfred's questline. The access to Cainhurst, riding a spectral carriage that appears at a specific location after you use the Cainhurst summons, is one of the game's most effective atmospheric transitions. You go from the Forbidden Woods, a dark and organic environment, to a snow-covered Baroque castle, a complete shift in visual register that marks Cainhurst as genuinely different from the rest of Yharnam's world. Cainhurst's interior, with its animated armoured guardians and blood-stained covered floors, tells a story of a massacre that has never been cleaned up. The church's executioners came here and killed everyone they could find, and the aftermath is preserved as a kind of evidence of the act. The castle has not moved on from that night. The Pthumerian descendant of Cainhurst, or the lore connection between Cainhurst's aristocracy and the Pthumerian bloodline, is one of the game's more interesting genealogical threads. The Vilebloods may not be simply heretics by church definition. They may carry an older and more direct connection to the Pthumerians than anything the church itself could claim. Queen Annalise's claim that the Vilebloods possess a pure blood lineage going back to the Pthumerian era is self-interested. She has every reason to claim legitimacy against the church, but it is not obviously false. The Chalice dungeons, Pthumerian Queen, and the Cainhurst Queen share certain visual and thematic similarities that the game seems to want you to notice. The Yahargul, the unseen village, is accessible through two routes that correspond to different points in the game's progression and produce very different experiences of the same location. The early access, through being captured and waking in a cell, introduces the location through vulnerability. The main game access, through the same path, approaches it as a confrontation. Yahargul was the site of the Mensis scholars' ritual, and its state by the time of the main game reflects what that ritual did to the people who lived there. The residents have been transformed into the choir-adjacent entities that carry lanterns and drain frenzy. The architecture has been altered by the Blood Moon's proximity. It is a district that has been sacrificed for the scholars' purposes. The village in the Forbidden Woods, mentioned earlier, is easy to rush through on the way to Bergenworth, but its specific details reward attention. The snake-infested villagers ring bells in a pattern that suggests some residual ritual practice, as though they remember they were supposed to be doing something ceremonial, even after the transformation has removed the understanding of why. The area outside Josef Ecker's clinic, accessible from the Forbidden Woods, allows you to bypass the clinic's front and enter from the back, where you find the transformed patients. This is one of the game's most deliberately uncomfortable player choice scenarios. You made the decision to send people there. Now you are seeing the result of that decision from the inside. Chapter 15. The item descriptions as primary text. The item descriptions in Bloodborne are the game's primary lore text, and their writing style is worth examining as a craft choice as much as a lore delivery mechanism. They are short, fragmentary, and deliberately incomplete, leaving more questions than they answer. The descriptions tend to focus on a single specific property of the item and use that property as a window into larger questions. A sword is described in terms of the material it was made from and what that material suggests about its maker's intentions. A rune is described in terms of what it enables and what that enabling implies about who created it. The use of the word suggests in item descriptions is consistent and pointed. The descriptions almost never assert facts about the game's history and cosmology. They suggest, they point toward, they indicate. This is partly a translation choice and partly a design choice, and both the Japanese original and the English translation maintain this epistemic humility. The descriptions of blood and blood-adjacent items are particularly careful with their language, describing effects and properties. Without fully explaining the mechanisms, you learn what a blood vial does without learning exactly how it does it, which means the game preserves a space of the unknown, even for the most mundane items. The rune descriptions are among the most lore-dense items in the game. The runes are described as fragmentary glimpses of the language of the Great Ones, material attempts to write down something that does not have a natural written form. The fact that these fragmentary writings provide specific mechanical bonuses suggests that even an incomplete copy of a Great One's language carries some of its power. The Carol rune system, named for a transcriber who heard the Great One's murmuring and attempted to write it down, is one of the lore's more charming concepts. Carol was essentially a linguist, working in an impossible field, trying to capture sounds that no human writing system was designed to represent, producing approximations that nonetheless work. The Edon Writhe rune, which creates quicksilver bullets from successful visceral attacks, is described in terms that suggest Edon rewards aggressive and precise combat. Whether this represents the Formless Great One's actual preferences or simply the properties of its blood extracted from its essence is unclear, but the mechanical reward structure of the game's design and the lore attributes align. The moon runes, which increase the blood echoes gained from killing enemies, are associated with the moon presence. Their effect, making the accumulation of blood echoes more efficient, is consistent with the hypothesis that the moon presence has an interest in the collection or concentration of blood echoes, and that the runes it is associated with reflect this interest. The radiance and guidance runes, associated with the hunt and with the church, reflect the ideals of their originating institutions in their effects. Radiance increases health regeneration during visceral attacks, emphasizing endurance and recovery. Guidance increases rally potential, emphasizing the hunt's momentum and the hunter's ability to reclaim vitality through aggression. The corruption rune, associated with the Vile Blood Covenant, increases quicksilver bullets at the cost of health, reflecting the Vile Blood philosophy of using the body itself as a resource for power. The rune's name, corruption, is the Church's framing of the Vile Blood practice, and the fact that it is labelled that way in the game's menu reflects the Church's perspective rather than a neutral assessment. Chapter 16: Fan Theories and Community Interpretations. The Bloodborne community has developed several significant interpretive frameworks over the years since the game's release, and some of them have accumulated enough textual support to be worth treating as serious readings, even if they remain speculative. The theory that the hunter is female by default, or that the canonical hunter is specifically the doll's maker or Lady Maria herself, has been discussed at length in community spaces. The evidence is largely circumstantial, based on the doll's specific emotional response to the hunter and on certain item descriptions. But it is a coherent reading. The interpretation of the Great Ones as fundamentally sad rather than malevolent is one of the community's more persistent and, in this editor's view, persuasive readings. Every Great One in the game appears to be defined by loss, searching for something, waiting for something, trying to reconnect with something that was taken from them. Their interactions with humanity are desperate rather than predatory. The reading of the Blood Moon is a literal manifestation of grief. The grief of the Great One who lost Murgo is consistent with this interpretation. The Blood Moon is not the Great One's attacking, it is the Great One's mourning. Yharnam is caught in the crossfire of cosmic grief rather than cosmic aggression. The theory about the player character's origin, specifically the possibility that you are not simply a random traveller, but someone with a specific pre-existing connection to the Great Ones, or to the dream, has been supported by various item descriptions, and by the Moon Presence's specific behaviour towards you. The dream does not take everyone. Why does it take you? The Gehrman's guilt theory, which suggests that Gehrman's imprisonment in the dream is partly self-imposed as a punishment for what happened to Maria and other hunters, is an emotional, rather than a strictly textual reading, but is consistent with everything the game shows you about his character. He is not just trapped, he is ashamed. The interpretation of the doll as more self-aware and more suffering than she appears has significant community support. Her stated happiness to be alive, her acknowledgement that she has no memories, and her tears at the true ending are consistent with a character who has made peace with her situation through a kind of willed acceptance rather than genuine contentment. The theory that Cainhurst and Yharnam were once allied rather than simply neighbouring powers, based on architectural similarities and on the specific nature of the Vile Blood's blood type, suggests a shared origin that predates the Church's condemnation of Cainhurst. The alliance broke over blood theology, but the shared history is visible in the structures. The reading of Murgo as already dead, with the nightmare sustaining its cries artificially, is one of the more metaphysically interesting community theories. If Murgo is dead, then the nightmare of Mensis is a space dedicated to an unresolvable grief, rather than a space protecting a living entity. The wet nurse is guarding a cradle that is already empty. The interpretation of the true ending's small form, as genuinely hopeful rather than ambiguous, has the support of several developers' comments, though the game itself resists definitive statements. The creature is small and helpless, yes, but it is alive in a way that was not previously possible, and the doll's tears are the tears of someone watching a transformation she could not have anticipated, which is not necessarily grief. Chapter 17: Development Context and Artistic Decisions. Bloodborne was developed by From Software under Hidetaka Miyazaki, the same director responsible for Demon's Souls and the Dark Souls series, and it represents a significant shift in his thematic concerns from the medieval and religious to the Victorian and cosmic. The shift to a Victorian setting appears to be connected to Miyazaki's interest in the specific anxieties of that period, the collision between scientific materialism and religious faith, the expansion of the known world through exploration and colonialism, and the sense that certainty was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as new knowledge arrived from unexpected directions. H.P. Lovecraft is the most commonly cited literary influence on Bloodborne, and the comparison is apt at the level of cosmological structure, the indifferent universe, the transformative horror of cosmic contact, and the specific kinds of madness that come from knowledge of what exists beyond the human scale. But the game departs from Lovecraft in important ways. Lovecraft's cosmic horror is fundamentally about smallness, about the crushing recognition that humanity is insignificant. Bloodborne is more interested in the dangerous proposition that humanity might be significant, that humans might be capable of something like ascension or contact. The horror is not that we don't matter, but that we might matter in ways that are terrible for us. The Victorian medical setting allows Bloodborne to explore anxieties about the medical establishment and its relationship to the people it treats, anxieties that have remained current since the game's release. The Church, as a healthcare institution that conceals the costs of its treatments, is a critique that landed with considerable force. The design of the game's enemies reflects a consistent principle that transformation should retain traces of what was transformed. The beasts look like the people they were. The cleric beast retains a roughly human skeleton at enormous scale. Ludwig's human half resurfaces in his second phase. The humanity is still there, buried under the transformation, which is part of what makes the encounters so affecting. The Chalice dungeons were a significant development investment that produced lore of enormous importance, but received less community attention than the main game environments. Whether this was a design miscalculation or a deliberate choice to make the oldest history literally the most difficult to access is a question the developers have not fully addressed. The DLC content in The Old Hunters represents a decision to focus on the human cost of the hunting tradition rather than the cosmic cosmology, and this focus produces some of the game's most affecting storytelling. The DLC is smaller in scope, but higher in emotional intensity than the main game, which is consistent with the decision to concentrate its narrative on a few specific characters. The endings of Bloodborne being largely positive in most readings, even the ambiguous ones, represents a departure from the Souls series' more consistently melancholic conclusions. Bloodborne is, under all of its horror, a game about the possibility of something genuinely new, and each ending represents a different answer to the question of what new thing is possible. Chapter 18, The Final Mysteries, and What Remains Unknown. After everything the game and the community and the developers have offered, there are things about Bloodborne that remain genuinely unknown, not simply unconfirmed, but actively mysterious in ways that continued investigation of existing texts has not resolved. The nature of the hunter's dream before the game begins, specifically how long it has existed and how many hunters have passed through it, is not established. The cemetery of hunter graves suggests many, but the dream's relationship to time is unclear enough that many could mean many years or many centuries. The identity of the moon presence's goals, beyond sustaining the dream and collecting blood echoes, is not explained. Its reaction to the true ending, the flash of apparent panic or horror before the new Great One is born, suggests it understood what 3 umbilical cords would produce and was unable to prevent it, but why it could not prevent it, and what its interest in preventing it was, remains open. The fate of Byrgenwerth, after Willem's establishment of the school, and before its abandonment, is partially but not fully traced. There were students, there were expeditions to the Chalice dungeons, there was the fishing hamlet incident, but the sequence of events, the specific timeline and the full roster of who was responsible for what, is not recoverable from the existing texts. The relationship between the Great Ones and each other is almost entirely unexplored. Do they communicate? Do they have interests in relation to each other, as well as in relation to humanity? The cosmology presents them as separate entities, but gives almost no information about their relationships or the politics of the cosmic plane. Whether there are Great Ones beyond the ones shown in the game is implied by the scale of the cosmos suggested in late-game item descriptions, but is not confirmed. The ones you encounter: Amygdala, Rom, the Moon Presence, Ebrietas, Murgo, Kos, and the implied Eden may be a small subset of a much larger category. The question of whether the transformation process can be reversed is one the game declines to answer. Several characters have maintained significant humanity despite heavy blood consumption, but none of them appear to have reversed transformation already in progress. The blood goes one direction. The nature of the Great One's language, the one that Carol attempted to transcribe into runes, is not established beyond its effects. Whether the Great Ones communicate intentionally, or whether the language is simply a property that emanates from them without deliberate transmission, is a distinction the game leaves open. The fate of the world outside Yharnam on the night of the hunt is, as noted, completely unaddressed. The blood moon over Yharnam is presumably visible from distance. The nightmare's permeability may not be limited to Yharnam's specific geography. Whether other cities have hunters and whether other hunts were occurring simultaneously is not explored. The specific mechanism of the hunter's dream's relationship to the doll is one of the game's genuine mysteries. She is there, she was made from Lady Maria's likeness, but whether she was created by the moon presence, by Gehrman, by some other force, or by some process that involved Maria herself, is not established. The possibility that the game takes place in a cycle and that the player character has been through the dream before, in previous iterations, is a theory that has community support but no definitive textual confirmation. If the cycle has repeated, then the hunter's progress represents not a first awakening, but a resumption, which changes the emotional meaning of the ending considerably. The thing that makes Bloodborne's mysteries sustaining more than a decade after its release is that they are not mysteries born of carelessness. Everything in the game feels deliberate. The gaps in the lore feel chosen rather than overlooked. You are never quite sure whether the thing you don't know was left out because it doesn't matter, or because it matters more than anything else. That quality, the sense that the unknown is not simply absent, but present in a different form, is what makes Bloodborne's lore one of the more remarkable bodies of storytelling in contemporary games. The city of Yharnam, the healing church, the Great Ones, the hunters, the nightmare spaces, Gehrman in his wheelchair, in the dream, all of it points towards something that the game knows, and that you can feel, but never quite say out loud. The blood was real, the transformation was real, the Great Ones were real, and somewhere in the dream, in the small, fragile form of something that used to be a hunter who came to a city seeking treatment on a terrible night, something new woke up that had never existed before. That is where the records end. Chapter 19. The mechanics of blood and their lore implications, and the game's insistence on framing its systems in terms of blood and insight means that the way you play is also the way you inhabit the world's cosmology. You are not simply pressing buttons. You are consuming blood, gaining insight, and progressively transforming in ways the game tracks and reflects back to you. The blood vials you carry and consume during combat are the most basic expression of this. You are healing yourself with blood, the same blood that is causing the transformations around you. Your character is doing the same thing the Yharnamites did, just with more awareness of the context and with the advantage of a body that has been through the dream's calibration. The fact that you run out of blood vials and need to find more creates a specific kind of resource anxiety that is different from other games' health items. You are always aware of how much blood you have and how quickly you are spending it. The economy of blood in combat mirrors the larger economy of blood in the game's world, where spending it brings power, but scarcity is always present. Blood echoes, the currency and experience system, are described in item descriptions as the accumulated life experience and memory of the dead. When you pick up blood echoes from a fallen enemy, you are consuming the condensed essence of their existence. This is not presented with moral weight in the game's mechanics, but the description is there, and it means something. Losing blood echoes on death, and having to recover them from your bloodstain is a mechanic shared with the Souls series. But in Bloodborne's lore, it takes on a specific quality. The bloodstain is not just a marker, it is a concentration of memory and experience that is literally leaking out of the world, becoming accessible to anyone who reaches it first. The Rune Workshop tool, which allows you to inscribe runes onto your character, is mechanically just a menu unlock. But in lore terms, it is a process of writing Great One language onto or into the hunter's body. The physical inscription of fragments of cosmic language is consistent with the broader body modification theme of the game's world. Visceral attacks, the critical strike mechanic, are activated by interrupting an enemy's attack with a gunshot and then plunging your hand into the wound. The intimacy and specificity of the attack, the physical entry into the body, reflects something about the hunter tradition's relationship to the transformations they combat. You are reaching into the beast at its most vulnerable moment. The rune that buffs visceral attacks, the one associated with Odin, suggests that the formless Great One of blood and voice is specifically connected to this moment of physical contact and penetration. Whether Odin rewards this because it resembles something it values, or simply because it occurs in a context rich with blood, is not specified. The insight currency system is, as noted, a direct mechanic to lore translation, but the specific things that cost and grant insight are worth examining carefully. Seeing a Great One for the first time grants insight. Defeating a Great One's navel grants insight. Touching a Great One's navel grants insight. Each of these represents a specific type of cognitive encounter with the cosmic. The loss of insight through combat with brain suckers is the clearest example of insight, as something that can be taken from you rather than simply accumulated. The brain suckers are not attacking in the conventional sense, they are extracting. The experience of having insight forcibly removed is described in the game through the visual effect of the brain sucker's attack, which shows a mist rising from the hunter's head. The madman's knowledge items. The glowing skulls found throughout the game are described as the skulls of former scholars whose intense pursuit of knowledge produced a physical manifestation of that knowledge in the bone. Consuming them transfers some of that crystallized knowledge to you. The image of knowledge becoming so intense it crystallizes in the skull is one of the game's more vivid metaphors for what insight costs. The difference between the madman's knowledge and the Great One's wisdom items is one of degree and source. The knowledge comes from scholars, humans, who pursued the Great One's secrets and paid with their sanity. The wisdom comes from closer proximity to the Great Ones themselves, representing a purer or more complete fragment of the cosmic. Both grant the same mechanical resource but from different directions. The rally mechanic, which allows you to regain health by dealing damage quickly after being hit, is one of Bloodborne's more distinctive mechanical choices, and its lore framing is consistent with the hunter tradition. The hunters do not back away from damage, they press forward, using aggression as both offense and defense, reclaiming their vitality through momentum. This mechanic reflects something about how the church hunters were trained and what they believed about the hunt. The hunt's theology was not about caution and survival. It was about commitment and advance. The rally mechanic mechanically enforces a playing style that is consistent with the hunter tradition's ideology, making the game feel like it is coaching you in the church's values, whether you intend to absorb them or not. The rally mechanic's relationship to beast aggression is also notable. Beasts do not rally, they simply take and deal damage. The distinction between the hunter's ability to reclaim vitality through aggression and the beast's inability to do so suggests that the hunting tradition retains something cognitively and vitally human even under extreme conditions, at least up to a point. Chapter 20. Yharnam's daily life before the hunt. Reconstructing what Yharnam was like as a functioning city before the night of the hunt requires reading the environmental evidence against the current devastation to find what was normal underneath. The game provides enough material for this reconstruction, even though it never shows you Yharnam as it was. The shops in Central Yharnam still have merchandise on their shelves and counters. The merchandise includes goods that are not hunt-related, ordinary household items, food, fabric. There was a domestic economy here. People bought and sold things that had nothing to do with the church or the blood. The residential areas of Central Yharnam have furniture, fireplaces, cooking equipment, and the other fixtures of ordinary domestic life. The evidence of children, as noted, is present in the form of toys and small furniture. Families lived in these buildings. The buildings were homes before they became the hunting ground the game presents them as. The healing church's presence in daily life would have been enormous by the time the game begins. Its theology would have been the dominant framework through which Yharnamites understood illness, healing, life and death. The church's blood ministration would not have been a specialist medical procedure. It would have been as ordinary as vaccination is in the modern world. The social stratification of Yharnam is visible in the architecture. The cathedral ward is significantly grander than Central Yharnam, and the upper districts associated with the church hierarchy are more elaborate and more isolated from the city's working districts below. Class was visible in Yharnam, the way it was visible in any Victorian city. The hunters existed as a recognized profession within the society. Not everyone who encountered them would have understood the full scope of what they did, but the public-facing function, patrolling the streets during outbreaks and removing beasts before they could harm civilians, would have been known. The hunter's relationship to the church would have been understood as analogous to a police or military relationship to the state. The cathedral ward's role as the city's religious and civic centre means that in normal times it would have been a place of pilgrimage and public ceremony. The church ceremonies are not described in detail, but the presence of large gathering spaces and ceremonial architecture suggests they were public events that the broader population participated in. The pilgrimage route to Yharnam would have been well established by the time of the game's events. The city's medical reputation was international, and the infrastructure for receiving pilgrims, the clinics, the lodgings, the guides, would have been a significant part of the local economy. The researchers and students at Bergenworth represent a different social layer, the intellectual class that was investigating Yharnam's Pthumerian heritage from a scholarly rather than religious perspective. Their relationship to the church was apparently complex, with periods of collaboration and periods of tension. The conflict between scholarly investigation and religious framing is one of the law's recurring tensions. What Bergenworth found in the Pthumerian ruins could be interpreted religiously, as the church did, or empirically as the scholars tried to do. The empirical approach eventually became indistinguishable from the religious one, when the subjects being studied were the great ones themselves. The fishing hamlet community, before the old hunters arrived, would have been a normal coastal community, with a specific local distinction. The presence of a great one's remains on or near their shore. How they related to that presence, whether they worshipped it, feared it, or simply lived alongside it, is suggested by their transformation, but not fully explained. The economic relationship between Yharnam and the outside world would have involved the export of blood administration services, and possibly blood derivatives, and the import of the pilgrims' economic activity and the raw materials needed for the city's industrial and church functions. Yharnam was not self-sufficient. It was a specialized city in a larger economy. The existence of the Cainhurst aristocracy as a separate power centre from the church suggests that Yharnam's region had a feudal or quasi-feudal political structure in which the church's influence had to coexist with older aristocratic claims. The tension between the church and Cainhurst was partly theological and partly political, a dispute over which institution had the right to define blood's sacred or profane status. Chapter 21. The Architecture of the Hunt. The architecture of Yharnam is not just a visual setting. It is a designed, combat, and navigation environment, and the lore dimensions of its design choices are worth examining alongside the aesthetic and functional ones. The labyrinthine quality of Central Yharnam, with its interconnected bridges, alleys, rooftops, and sewers, reflects a city that grew organically over a long period without a unified plan and vision. The density and complexity of the streets means that during a hunt, both hunters and prey can use the terrain in multiple ways, and the game's level design makes this legible. The gates and barriers throughout the city suggest a civic response to the beast problem that predates the current hunt. Some gates appear to have been hastily erected. Others are more permanent structures. The city's residents and authorities had clearly developed procedures for containing beast outbreaks in specific areas, and the physical evidence of those procedures is visible in the level design. The lanterns throughout the city, both the fast travel lampposts and the ordinary street lighting, reflect Yharnam's late Victorian technology level. Gas lighting would be the standard for a city of this era and setting, and the warm orange glow of the lamps creates one of the game's most consistent atmospheric elements. The sewer and undercity systems beneath Central Yharnam are more extensive than you would expect from the surface-level geography, reflecting the Pthumerian-era construction underneath and the centuries of infrastructure development that built on top of it. The sewers connect areas that would not otherwise be connected, providing both shortcuts and explanations for how certain things moved through the city undetected. The bridges of Yharnam are one of its most distinctive visual features. the arching stone bridges connecting elevated platforms and buildings. Their height and fragility suggest a city that valued vertical space, perhaps because the horizontal space was contested, or perhaps because proximity to the sky carried some religious significance. The clock tower structures throughout the city are an architectural motif worth noting. Clocks are present in multiple locations, and as noted, many of them appear to have stopped. The astral clock tower of the DLC makes the clock motif explicit as a narrative element. Time, measurement, memory, and the mechanical preservation of the present against the past's intrusion are all in this motif. The church's Gothic architecture, with its high vaulted ceilings and pointed arches, is both a historical reference and a design choice that creates specific kinds of spatial experience for the player. The verticality of the cathedral ward's interiors creates a sense of scale that emphasizes the smallness of the human figure within the church's spaces. The contrast between the open, illuminated public spaces of the cathedral ward and the narrow, shadowed streets of Central Yharnam is a deliberate design choice that encodes the social structure of the city. The church's domain is open and dramatic. The working city is compressed and dark. The research hall of the Old Hunters DLC uses institutional architecture, high ceilings, large windows, examination tables, filing cabinets to create a space that is recognizably medical in its design language before the transformations make it something else. The horror of the research hall is partly produced by the legibility of what it was supposed to be. Chapter 22, The Philosophy of the Hunt, and Bloodborne's themes. Bloodborne has been interpreted through multiple philosophical frameworks by the community, and while none of them are definitive, several illuminate specific aspects of the game's concerns in ways that feel productive rather than forced. The Nietzschean reading of Bloodborne focuses on the will to power and the transformation of humanity into something beyond humanity. The Great Ones represent a kind of Übermensch ideal that the game's factions pursue, and the various outcomes of that pursuit illustrate the difference between genuine self-overcoming and the delusion of self-overcoming. The Lovecraftian reading, as noted, is the most obvious and the most widely discussed, but the game's departures from Lovecraft are as significant as its borrowings. Lovecraft's horror is fundamentally conservative, the horror of change and contamination, and the dissolution of familiar structures. Bloodborne's horror is more ambivalent about change, acknowledging its cost while not foreclosing its possibility. The Gothic tradition provides another frame. Bloodborne participates in the Gothic's preoccupation with the past, refusing to die, with the return of the repressed, with institutional corruption and the secrets that institutions keep. The city of Yharnam is a Gothic city in every sense, a place where the past has not been processed and has therefore come back as something monstrous. The Victorian medical framework the game uses situates it in a specific history of medical ethics and medical power, the period when medicine was establishing its institutional authority, and doing so partly through practices that would not survive modern ethical scrutiny. The Church's blood ministry is recognizable as a specific kind of institutional medicine, one that prioritizes its own continuation and authority over the well-being of its patients. The colonial dimensions of the game's history, the old hunters going to the fishing hamlet and taking what they needed from its people, are present in the lore even if they are not foregrounded. The pattern of a technologically and institutionally powerful group extracting value from a less powerful community and leaving devastation behind is recognizable and is not presented approvingly. The game's treatment of religion is complex enough to resist simple anti-clerical or pro-spiritual readings. The Church is clearly an institution that used religious framing to serve institutional interests, but the underlying theological reality it was groping toward, that the Great Ones exist and that contact with them is possible, is not false. The Church was wrong about what that contact would mean for humanity, but it was not wrong about the contact's possibility. This is a distinction that matters for the game's philosophical texture. Bloodborne is not a debunking narrative. It does not say that the Church was wrong to believe in something greater. It says the Church was wrong about what greatness looks like, and wrong about how to pursue it, and catastrophically wrong about the cost of the pursuit. The question of who bears responsibility for what happened to Yharnam is one the game distributes across its characters and institutions in a way that resists simple answers. The Church made choices. Individual hunters and scholars made choices. The great ones, proximity, whether invited or incidental, had consequences. The accumulation of these choices and consequences produced the night of the hunt, but no single decision is sufficient to explain the catastrophe. The hunter's position as an outsider who comes to the city and is absorbed into its crisis is a structural choice that allows the player to encounter the law through discovery rather than through prior knowledge. You learn what the healing church is, what the hunt is, what the blood does, in the same order that evidence for these things becomes available. The sense of accumulating understanding mirrors the game's law structure. The ending of the game's narrative, with a transformation rather than a resolution, is consistent with the game's interest in process over conclusion. Bloodborne does not resolve its questions. It transforms the person asking them. The hunter who reaches the end of the game is not the same as the hunter who arrived at Iosifka's clinic, and the game's final image is of something genuinely new rather than something that has achieved a predetermined goal. Chapter 23: Specific Enemy Lore in Depth. The enemies of Bloodborne are not random encounter tables. They are specific entities with histories, and the most interesting of them have lore dimensions that illuminate the game's larger concerns. The Huntsman. The basic human enemies of Central Yharnam are the city's civilian population in various stages of transformation or agitation. Their behavior, aggressive and territorial rather than predatory, reflects people who are scared and have armed themselves rather than people who have lost their humanity to the point of pure predation. The difference between the huntsman and the fully transformed beasts is significant and deliberate. The huntsman can still be approached with some degree of caution. The beasts cannot be negotiated with. The design of the enemy progression from huntsman to beasts mirrors the law's progression from early blood consumption to full transformation. The carrion crows, found throughout Yharnam, are scavengers who have been feeding on the dead and are themselves transforming as a result. Their aggressive behavior reflects both hunger and the early stages of blood-driven transformation, and their presence in the streets emphasizes the secondary transmission effect mentioned earlier. The werewolves, or the large wolf-like beasts found in specific locations, are among the more traditional-seeming monster designs in a game that generally avoids straightforward genre monsters. Their presence in specific locations associated with the church suggests they were once church-affiliated individuals who transformed along a specifically canine trajectory. The church giants, again, are church officials whose transformation has produced beings of enormous scale and strength, but recognizably church-influenced design language. The specific weapons some of them carry, items associated with church ceremony, are literal extensions of their original roles into their transformed state. The Shadows of Yharnam, encountered mid-game, are a significantly more unusual enemy type. They are dressed in Eastern-influenced garb and use fire and snake-based magic in ways that are connected to the Pthumrian and Cainhurst bloodlines rather than the church. Their presence in Yharnam proper suggests they came there for a specific purpose. The shadows appear to be guardians of Queen Annalise, sent to prevent access to Cainhurst or to protect something associated with the Val bloodline. Their design, distinct from the rest of Yharnam's enemies, marks them as outsiders, which makes their presence in the city a piece of in-law political intelligence. The brain-sucker enemies, found in the Research Hall and Bergenworth areas, appear to be patients or students who have transformed through arcane experimentation in a direction that preserved and then overdeveloped their cognitive functions. Their attack, which drains insight, suggests they are beings that are driven to consume the kind of knowledge they themselves were consumed by. The celestial emissaries are, as noted, the choir's most advanced patients. Their docile behavior, only attacking when threatened, is one of the game's more affecting enemy designs because it makes their violence reactive rather than predatory. They are not hunting you, they are defending themselves, which shifts the ethical weight of the encounter. The Ebrietta's boss fight, in the context of everything established about her origin and her relationship to the choir's researchers takes on a specific emotional quality. She is not a monster to be defeated. She is an entity that was found in the Pthumerian ruins, left behind by other great ones, and was then discovered by the choir, and both used, and in some sense, given a kind of community. Killing Ebrietas feels like a loss in the game's lore context. She is not hostile in the way most bosses are hostile. She is large and dangerous, and in a confined space, but the opening of the fight, where she appears to be mourning or grieving, suggests something about her inner life that makes the encounter significantly sadder than most boss fights. The amygdalae as enemies, rather than as the passive entities that serve as teleporters, are significant specifically in the Upper Cathedral Ward and in Yahargul. Their regression in those contexts suggests that the cosmic entities have a specific territorial relationship to the spaces most deeply connected to the Great One rituals. The Watchers of the Chalice dungeons, as noted, are ancient guardians who have maintained their function across an enormous span of time. Their continued purpose, in the absence of any clear direction from the Pthumerians who set them their task, is one of the lore's more poignant elements, beings defined entirely by a function whose original context has vanished. The Loran Silver Beast and Loran Cleric Beasts in the deeper Chalice dungeons represent what the Loran civilization produced before its end. They are more ancient, and in some ways, more extreme versions of the same transformation trajectory that Yharnam is currently experiencing, and their presence in the dungeons alongside the remains of their civilization tells you the trajectory's endpoint. The Keeper of the Old Lords, with its flame and its air of authority, suggests a Pthumerian ruling class that maintained its elevated social position even through the transformation process. Whatever the Pthumerians understood about the blood, their social hierarchy appears to have survived it or been enforced through it, with the transformed elite retaining a kind of power over the transformed non-elite. Chapter 24: Time, Memory, and the Dream. The hunter's dream's relationship to time is one of the game's more philosophically interesting elements, and examining it carefully produces a picture of how the dream spaces function as preservation mechanisms rather than simply supernatural zones. The dream preserves its contents against the normal passage of time. Gehrman has been there long enough to age significantly from whatever age he was when he entered, but he has not died, suggesting the dream sustains life beyond its normal span while not reversing the aging that had already occurred when he arrived. The implication of this is that the hunter's dream has been operating for potentially centuries. Every hunter who passed through it, whose grave now marks the dream's lawn, spent some period of time there before being released back to the waking world or consumed by the cycle. The dream's history is the history of the hunt across a long span of time. Whether the hunters who passed through the dream knew how long they were there, or whether the dream's time functions differently from waking time, is not established. It is possible that hunters experienced the dream as a brief interlude between hunts. It is equally possible that they were aware of the distortion. Gehrman's awareness of the dream's nature, his own imprisonment, and the moon presence's role is clearly complete. He has had a very long time to understand his situation. His attempts to communicate this understanding to the hunter you play are constrained by his inability to speak freely about the moon presence's role, suggesting the dream has rules about what can be said within it. The doll's lack of prior memories before coming to the dream is consistent with the dream being a created space rather than a place with a natural history. She did not come from somewhere else and arrive in the dream. She was made in or for the dream, and the dream is the entirety of her experience. This makes the doll's gentle character something more than conditioning or programming. She is, in a sense, a being whose entire psychology was formed by the dream, rather than by the waking world's conflicts and traumas. The dream's peaceful aesthetic, relative to Yharnam's horror, is her entire reference point for what existence is like. The question of what happens to the dream after the true ending, when the hunter has become a new Great One, is not addressed. Gehrman is dead. The moon presence is presumably destroyed or displaced. The doll is weeping. Whether the dream dissolves, persists, or transforms into something else is one of the things the game declines to tell you. The preservation of the worst of the old hunt in the hunter's nightmare rather than in the hunter's dream, is a significant architectural distinction in the game's cosmology. The dream is a space of rest and possibility. The nightmare is a space of containment and repetition. The same night is being lived again and again in the nightmare, with the hunters trapped in it, unable to move beyond what they did. Whether the containment is punishment or simply physics, whether the nightmare exists because some force decided these hunters needed to be contained, or simply because the weight of what they did created a space that could not be integrated into normal time and space, is another of the game's open questions. Simon's presence in the nightmare, as a researcher rather than a hunter, adds a dimension to the containment theory. If the nightmare captures those who know too much, as well as those who did too much, then it is less a judgment and more a consequence, a space that forms around certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of guilt, regardless of the nature of the knowledge or guilt. Chapter 25, The Endings and What They Mean. Bloodborne offers 3 distinct endings, and each one deserves careful analysis, not just as a narrative outcome, but as a statement about what the game thinks the hunter's story is ultimately about. The first ending, the Yharnam Sunrise ending, involves accepting Gehrman's offer to release you from the dream. You kneel before him, he uses his burial blade on you, and the game shows you leaving the dream as the sun rises over Yharnam. The night of the hunt is over. You are free. This ending is the most straightforward in its emotional register and the most ambiguous in its implications. You got out. The city you came to for treatment is behind you. The sun is rising, but the cycle continues. And the next hunter will be in the dream, waiting for you to have been where Gehrman was. The second ending, the Moon Presence ending, involves refusing Gehrman's offer. You fight and defeat him, and the Moon Presence descends and attempts to absorb you into its system. If you do not have the 3 umbilical cords, this absorption succeeds, and you replace Gehrman as the caretaker of the dream. This ending is, narratively, the worst outcome. You have escaped the death that Gehrman offered, which was a real release in exchange for an imprisonment of indefinite duration. The Moon Presence has exactly what it wanted, a new hunter caretaker for the dream, and the cycle is simply perpetuated with you in a different role. The third ending, the childhood ending or the true ending, requires having consumed all 3 umbilical cords and then fighting both Gehrman and the Moon Presence. Defeating the Moon Presence triggers the transformation described earlier, and the game ends with the doll cradling the small new Great One form. The true ending's interpretation, as hopeful, rests on several observations. You have broken the cycle. You have escaped both the release Gehrman offered, which was death, and the absorption the Moon Presence attempted. You have become something new that was not anticipated by any of the systems in the game. The doll's weeping is grief for your transformation, but also the grief of someone witnessing something unprecedented. The choice of 3 umbilical cords as the mechanism for the true ending's transformation is deliberate. Each cord represents a different mode of contact between humanity and the Great Ones. Consuming all 3 is an act of synthesis, bringing together different channels of the cosmic into a single body. The result is not simply more of what you were, but something genuinely different. Whether the new Great One form you achieve is a good thing for you, for Yharnam, for the world, is not addressed. You are small and helpless in that form. You are also alive and free, in a way that the cycle had never produced before. The game trusts you to decide what that means. The doll's role in the true ending is one of its most affecting elements. She has cared for you throughout the game. She has leveled you up, answered your questions, expressed quiet affection. Now she cradles what you have become, which is no longer recognizably the person she tended. Her tears are real, and they are for both the loss of what you were and the impossibility of understanding what you are now. Gehrman's line in the second ending, where he calls you the best of hunters, is a genuine compliment from a person who has seen many hunters. The fact that this compliment precedes his replacement by you as the dream's prisoner is one of the game's more quietly brutal ironies. The hunter's journey across all 3 endings is the same in its content but different in its conclusion. In all 3 you do the same things, fight the same bosses, accumulate the same insight, The difference is what you choose to do with what you have become. And that choice determines not what kind of story you experienced, but what kind of person or being you are at its end. Chapter 26. Comparative Lore Across from Software Games. Bloodborne exists in a specific relationship to the Souls series that goes beyond shared mechanics. Several lore elements and themes recur across the games in ways that suggest a consistent set of concerns about what games can explore and how. The concept of a world in decline that is being held together by forces that have become oppressive in their effort to maintain the status quo appears across multiple Miyazaki games. Dark Souls has its Age of Fire, maintained by recurring sacrifices. Bloodborne has its hunt perpetuated by the moon presence and the dream. The maintenance of a system past its natural endpoint, at enormous cost, is a recurring theme. The figure of the ancient person who has lived too long and knows too much and is tired appears in multiple games. Gehrman is a specific version of this figure, distinguished from the Souls equivalents by his specific imprisonment and his specific longing not for continuation, but for release. The use of item descriptions as primary lore delivery, rather than cutscenes or direct exposition, is consistent across all the From Software games of this era. It creates a specific relationship between the player and the game's history, one in which the player must actively construct the narrative rather than receive it passively. The recurring figure of patches across multiple games, including as the spider version in Bloodborne, suggests either a continuous fictional character traveling across game worlds, which some fans enjoy as a meta-narrative, or more likely a tribute character that Miyazaki enjoys, including in varied forms, because the patches archetype, the charming rogue who exploits you for personal gain, but is ultimately not evil, is genuinely enjoyable to interact with. The theme of cycles being broken or perpetuated as the primary moral stakes of the endings is consistent across Dark Souls and Bloodborne. In both games, you are ultimately deciding whether the existing system continues or is transformed. In both cases, the transformation is ambiguous. Bloodborne is, if anything, slightly more optimistic about the possibility of genuine change than Dark Souls. The visual language of celestial horror, stars and eyes and tentacles, is present in From Software games before and after Bloodborne, but Bloodborne is its most concentrated expression. The outer gods of Bloodborne represent a specific refinement of anxieties that appear in more diffuse form elsewhere in the catalogue. The design philosophy of trusting the player to encounter the world on the world's terms, without excessive guidance or protective scaffolding, is consistent across the games and produces a specific kind of player engagement that is more common in literary fiction than in mainstream games. You are expected to pay attention and to tolerate uncertainty, and the reward for that attention is a coherence that emerges gradually from apparently disconnected details. Chapter 27. The Legacy of Bloodborne. Bloodborne's lore has continued to be discussed, analysed, and debated for years after its release, and its specific approach to world building has had clear influence on subsequent games, both from Software and from other studios working in adjacent genres. The game's insistence on presenting its cosmic horror through a Victorian medical lens, rather than through a more conventional fantasy or horror lens, produced a visual and narrative vocabulary that has proved durable and influential. The sight of a church in ruins being reclaimed by tentacle iconography has become recognizable as a specific aesthetic register, partly because Bloodborne established it so effectively. The lore community around Bloodborne, which has produced thousands of analysis videos, written pieces, and forum discussions, represents one of gaming's more impressive examples of collaborative interpretive work. Individual researchers have made discoveries in item descriptions that have changed community understanding of major lore elements, demonstrating that the game rewards very close reading. The fishing hamlet as a location, the hunting nightmare as a concept, the specific design of the DLC's bosses, all of these have been discussed and analysed in ways that continue to produce new interpretations. The lore is not exhausted. There are still questions that have not been resolved, and the community continues to find ways to approach them. The game's approach to mental health, Specifically, the way insight and madness interact has been discussed in the context of broader conversations about how games represent psychological states. Bloodborne's insight system is not a clinical representation of any real condition, but it uses the language of perception and its limits in ways that have resonated with people who think about these questions. The question of whether Bloodborne will receive a sequel remains open as of the time the script was assembled. The game's ending, which closes the current story while opening an entirely new direction, is not inconsistent with continuation, but neither does it demand it. The story told in the game is complete in itself, and any continuation would need to engage with the transformation the true ending produces, rather than simply setting it aside. The specific relationship between Bloodborne's lore and its gameplay is one of the things that makes it a reference point in discussions of game design. The mechanics are not arbitrary, they are expressing the world. The way you play is the way you inhabit the cosmology, and that integration of system and story is something subsequent games have tried to replicate with varying degrees of success. Yharnam, as a city, has become one of the recognizable fictional cities in gaming, alongside Rapture and Midgar and Novigrad. It is a place that communicates its history through its physical form, where the architecture and the enemies and the item descriptions all point toward the same story from different angles. The world-building achievement of Yharnam is considerable, and its influence on how games approach city design and narrative environment is ongoing. Chapter 28. The supporting lore of covenants. The covenant system in Bloodborne connects to several of the game's most significant factions, and the covenant's lore dimensions illuminate the political and theological landscape of the hunt in ways that purely single-player play does not always foreground. The Hunter of Hunters Covenant, associated with Eileen the Crow, is the oldest surviving independent hunting tradition. It predates the Church and maintains its independence from it, which means it has survived multiple cycles of Church authority while maintaining a consistent ethical commitment that hunters who lose themselves must be stopped by other hunters. The logic of the Hunter of Hunters Covenant is one of institutional self-regulation. The Covenant's existence implies that the hunting tradition has always had this problem: hunters becoming the thing they hunt, and has always needed a specific response to it. The Church's failure to maintain this oversight internally is part of what accelerated the current night's catastrophe. The Vile Bloods Covenant, centered on Queen Annalise, offers the player a position within the Canehurst tradition. Joining it involves swearing loyalty to the Queen and participating in the collection of dregs, which are described as the dregs of the most refined blood, the remnants left at the bottom of a bottle of the Church's most carefully produced blood product. The dregs have an ironic quality in the lore. The Vile Bloods, condemned by the Church as having impure blood, are collecting the residue of the Church's own most refined product and presenting it to their queen. There is a kind of political commentary in this, the supposedly impure Vile Bloods finding value in what the pure Church discards. The Eden Writhe Covenant, such as it is more of a philosophical alignment than a formal organization. It is associated with the recognition of Edon's presence in the blood and in the voice, and with a form of hunting that is attentive to this presence, rather than simply conducting violence. The rune associated with it, as noted, rewards visceral attacks, suggesting that the most intimate forms of combat are the ones most aligned with Eden's interests. The League, which is a covenant introduced in an update and associated with Valter, Master of the League, is the most explicitly social covenant, focused on multiplayer cooperation and the ideal of ridding the world of vermin, a term that has specific resonance in the lore as a reference to something that Valter perceives that others cannot. Valtra's description of vermin, which only he and certain other hunters can see, suggests either a genuine insight into a real category of cosmic parasite or a form of perception-distorted madness. The ambiguity is deliberate. The League's dedication to something only its members can perceive is either the purest form of insight-based hunting or a very old form of institutionalized delusion, and the game does not tell you which. Chapter 29. The Children of Blood. Children occupy a specific and consistently significant role in Bloodborne's lore, and the way the game handles this is worth examining carefully because it is one of the more delicate things the game does. The children in the game are almost entirely absent from the main city during the hunt. This absence is pointed. Yharnam has children. The evidence is present in the houses, but they are not in the streets on the night of the hunt. Either they were sheltered before the chaos began, or something else accounts for their absence. The orphanage of the Upper Cathedral Ward is where some of Yharnam's children ended up, and their fate there is described through the lore with exactly the oblique restraint that characterizes Bloodborne's treatment of its most disturbing elements. The children were identified as having potential for insight, and were used accordingly. The specific children who were brought to the orphanage, as described in one item description as having been given over by their parents to the church, suggesting the parents may have believed they were giving their children a better future through church education rather than subjecting them to experimentation. The gap between what parents believed they were doing and what was actually done is one of the institutional crimes the law documents. The orphan enemies found in the orphanage area are among the most disturbing enemy designs in a game full of disturbing designs, not because they are grotesque in the standard sense, but because their design suggests beings that were human very recently and are in the middle of becoming something else. The Orphan of Kos in the Old Hunters DLC is, as noted, the child of the Great One Kos, born posthumously from her remains. Its appearance as an enemy you must defeat is one of the DLC's most demanding moral tests. You are killing a being whose entire existence has been defined by loss and absence. A being that is, by definition, an orphan in the most literal and final sense. The 3 umbilical cords, which are described as cord of the eye, suggest a specific biological relationship between the Great Ones and their children that differs from human reproduction but converges on similar outcomes. The cord being the physical link between parent and child, the channel through which the cosmic passes to the new being. Ariana's child, born during the game's events if you follow her questline, is the most direct example of a Great One child in the main game. The item description of the cord from her child's birth is one of the game's most remarkable pieces of writing, describing the birth as a manifestation of Great One interest in the human world through the most mundane of biological processes. Chapter 30, the final account. Every detail in Bloodborne points in the same direction, toward a world that pursued transcendence through blood and insight and paid for that pursuit in ways it could not have fully anticipated, and toward a single night in which all of those accumulated costs came due simultaneously. The city of Yharnam, the healing church, the workshop, the scholars of Bergenworth and Mensis, the aristocracy of Canehurst, the hunters who preceded you, all of them were reaching for something real. The Great Ones exist, the higher planes exist. The contact that the various factions sought is possible. None of them were wrong about that. What they were wrong about was what they were, what humanity is, what the cost of reaching for something genuinely beyond the human scale does to the beings who attempt the reach. The transformation is real, the insight is real, and the price of both is also real, paid in the bodies of the people of Yharnam, and in the long imprisonment of the first hunter, and in the silence of a city that used to be alive. The hunter who reaches the end of the game has done what none of the factions could manage, not through superior intelligence, or superior theology, or superior ruthlessness, but through something more like endurance, the willingness to keep moving through the night until morning, and through the specific accumulation of experiences that the night provided. The doll, cradling the small new form at the end of the true ending, is one of gaming's most quietly affecting images. She has tended countless hunters through the dream. She has watched them come and go, and be consumed, and be released. And now something genuinely new has emerged from the same process, something that could not have been predicted or planned for. What the new Great One will do, what the doll will do, what the dream will become in the absence of Gehrman and the moon presence. These are not questions the game answers. They are questions the game leaves you with as you leave it. Questions that feel appropriate to an ending that is also a beginning. Yharnam is quiet now. The blood moon is fading. The hunters are still in their nightmare, still ringing their bells, still caught in the night that defined them. But somewhere in the hunter's dream, in a space that was built from grief and imprisonment and has been transformed by the thing that passed through it. Something small and new and unprecedented is being held. And the records end there. Chapter 31, The Weapons of the Old Hunters in Detail. The Old Hunters DLC introduced a set of weapons that expand on the game's established weapon philosophy, while also adding specific lore context that connects them to the DLC's characters and locations. The Beast Cutter is a whip-like weapon made from layered wood and metal that transforms into something more compact for close quarters. It is associated with the old workshop tradition before the church's influence, and its practical, non-sacred design language marks it as a tool rather than a symbol. The weapon's lore description suggests it was developed specifically for dealing with the dense pack formations that beast outbreaks tend to produce. The Beast Claw weapon, which transforms the user's hands into raking weapons and allows them to embody a more bestial fighting style, is one of the DLC's most provocative weapons from a lore perspective. It allows you to fight the way a beast fights, which raises the question of whether the hunter tradition's efficacy was always partly about channeling the very thing it was hunting. The Simon's Bowblade, associated with the DLC's historian NPC, is a weapon that bridges the pre-firearms era with the industrial one. Its design suggests Simon came from a context or tradition that had not yet fully adopted firearms as the secondary weapon of choice, and adapted to the dream's resources accordingly. The Rakuyo, Lady Maria's weapon, has a lore description that connects it to her noble origin and to a specific narrative of a weapon received as a gift and carried through everything that came after. It is a weapon that has been through the fishing hamlet incident. It has been carried by someone who was trying to distance themselves from what was done there. The weapon holds that history in its description. The amygdalan arm, which is a literal severed limb of an amygdala functioning as a weapon, is one of the game's most grotesque weapons from a design perspective, and one of its most lore interesting from a thematic one. Using a piece of a Great One as a weapon suggests that the Great Ones are not invulnerable, that they can be physically damaged in ways that produce usable materials. The Bloodletter weapon, associated with a blood minister who went further into blood theology than the church officially sanctioned, transforms in a way that involves piercing the user's own hand with a stake, drawing their own blood to fuel its power. The self-harm dimension of the transformation connects to the broader blood theology of willing self-sacrifice as a form of devotion. The Ligarius Wheel, belonging to the executioner Alfred's mentor, is a massive two-handed weapon associated with the punishment of sinners, and specifically the vile bloods. Its spinning motion and the arcane sparks it produces suggest a weapon that has been sanctified through extended use in the church's service, accumulating a charge of righteous violence that can be deployed against the impure. The church pick, which transforms between a pick and an extended weapon, is one of the simpler DLC weapons in its design language, but carries a clear marker of church affiliation. The specific transformation from a compact maintenance tool to an extended combat weapon mirrors the church's broader pattern of presenting one face publicly and another privately. The Whirligig Saw, one of the most mechanically satisfying weapons in the DLC, is associated with a hunter's practical approach to large, durable beasts. The Spinning Saw Blade is an industrial adaptation, taking the technology of Yharnam's workshops and applying it to monster control. It has no religious dimension. It is simply extremely effective at cutting through transformed flesh.